From Caligula's strange seashell war to Bokassa-I's diamond-crowned rule, this is a calm yet chilling journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with why a young Roman ruler ordered soldiers to collect seashells as trophies, and move deeper into why a modern emperor spent millions on a golden throne while his people starved. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Caligula spirals of cruelty and golden seashells. When Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus ascended to the purple throne of Rome in March of 37 CE, the empire exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The brooding, paranoid reign of Tiberius had finally ended, and here was young Caligula, nicknamed Little Boots by his father's legions for the miniature military sandals he'd worn as a child in the Rhine camps. At 24, he possessed the golden bloodline of Augustus, the charisma his predecessor had utterly lacked, and most importantly, he was not Tiberius. The Senate showered him with honors, the people lined the streets in celebration, and even the Praetorian Guard seemed genuinely pleased with their new princeps. For the first few months, Caligula played his role with theatrical perfection. He recalled political exiles, distributed generous bonuses to the troops, staged magnificent gladiatorial games, and completed the public works projects that Tiberius had left languishing. The imperial treasury, bloated from years of Tiberius's miserly hoarding, seemed inexhaustible. Rome's new emperor appeared to embody every virtue the previous one had lacked: generosity, accessibility, enthusiasm for public spectacle, and a genuine love of the common people's adoration. But somewhere in those early months, perhaps around the time of his serious illness in late 37 CE, something fundamental shifted in Caligula's mind. Whether it was the fever that nearly killed him, the intoxicating realization of absolute power, or some deeper psychological fracture that had always lurked beneath his charming facade, the young emperor who recovered from his sickbed was not quite the same man who had fallen ill. The changes were subtle at first: sharper words to senators, more extravagant demands for ceremony, an increasing obsession with divine honors that made even his sycophantic courtiers uncomfortable. The transformation accelerated with breathtaking speed. By 38 CE, Caligula had begun demanding that senators approach him with the elaborate prostrations normally reserved for Eastern potentates. He constructed a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples, spanning nearly 3 miles from Baiae to the breakwater at Puteoli, simply so he could ride across it wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, a theatrical demonstration that he could accomplish what even Xerxes had failed to do. The bridge consumed enormous resources and served no practical purpose whatsoever, but it satisfied Caligula's growing need to prove his divinity through impossible spectacles. The Senate, that ancient body of grey-bearded patricians and ambitious plebeians, found themselves reduced to props in increasingly humiliating performances. Caligula delighted in forcing distinguished consuls to run alongside his chariot for miles, their togas hiked up and their dignity in tatters. He made senators bid against each other at gladiatorial games, driving prices to ruinous heights while he cackled at their discomfort. During formal sessions, he would interrupt solemn debates to share intimate details of his sexual encounters or to announce his latest divine revelations. But perhaps no episode better illustrated the emperor's descent into megalomania than his famous war against Neptune, god of the seas. In the summer of 40 CE, Caligula marched 3 full legions to the shores of Gaul. As if preparing for the long-anticipated invasion of Britain, the troops were battle-ready, the ships assembled, the logistics carefully planned. Observers expected to witness one of the great military campaigns of the age, a conquest that would rival Julius Caesar's subjugation of Gaul itself. Instead, they watched in stupefied silence as their emperor declared war on the ocean itself. Standing on the beach in his golden breastplate and purple cloak, Caligula bellowed commands at the waves as if they were enemy formations. He ordered his legionaries to charge into the surf, stabbing at the water with their gladii and hurling their peeler into the foam. Then came the most surreal command of all. "Gather shells," Caligula announced. "Collect the spoils of our victory over Neptune." For hours, hardened veterans of the Rhine and Danube campaigns found themselves crawling along the tide line, stuffing their helmets and pouches with cockles, mussels, and whatever other marine debris they could find. These, Caligula proclaimed, were the treasures of the deep, Neptune's surrender offering to his divine majesty. The shells were to be transported back to Rome as proof of this unprecedented naval victory. The emperor personally selected the finest specimens, holding them up to catch the light and praising their strategic value with the same enthusiasm a normal general might reserve for enemy battle standards. The legionaries, trained to follow orders without question, complied with mechanical precision, even as their minds reeled at the absurdity. What do you do when your emperor commands you to wage war on the fundamental forces of nature? How do you maintain military discipline when your supreme commander appears to have declared himself victor in a battle against the concept of wetness itself? They gathered shells. They loaded wagons with seaweed. They pretended that the retreating tide represented Neptune's tactical withdrawal, rather than the simple physics of lunar gravity. Back in Rome, the palace had become a theater of cruelty disguised as entertainment. Caligula's dinner parties, once merely extravagant, evolved into psychological torture chambers where the emperor's whims determined who would live to see dessert. He delighted in seating condemned prisoners next to prominent guests, allowing conversations to develop before casually ordering executions between courses. The condemned might be senators who had looked at him incorrectly, freedmen who had failed to laugh at his jokes, or simply random citizens whose faces displeased him that particular evening. The emperor's sense of humor ran toward the macabre. He once ordered a man's hands cut off and hung around his neck like a pendant, then forced him to walk through the dining room, announcing his crime, which had been nothing more than making an unflattering comment about the imperial cuisine. Another guest found his dinner interrupted when Caligula commanded his children, brought from their beds to watch their father's execution, explaining that it was never too early to learn the wages of disrespecting divine authority. Perhaps most famously, there was Incitatus, Caligula's beloved racehorse. What began as an eccentric affection for a prize stallion gradually transformed into a deliberate assault on Roman political tradition. The emperor built Incitatus, a palace of marble stalls, complete with ivory mangers and purple blankets. The horse dined on golden oats and wore jeweled bridles worth more than most senators' annual incomes. Slaves were assigned to ensure the animal's comfort, and visitors to the palace were expected to pay their respects to Incitatus as if greeting a human dignitary. The joke, if it was a joke, reached its apex when Caligula announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul. Roman tradition held the consulship as the highest elected office, the pinnacle of political achievement for ambitious aristocrats. Former consuls commanded legions, governed provinces, and guided the empire's destiny. To suggest that a horse might hold such a position was either brilliant satire or complete madness, and nobody in Caligula's court felt safe enough to determine which. The horse consul never materialized. Assassination intervened first, but the threat lingered over every senatorial session. How do you conduct serious business when your emperor might literally stable his dinner guest's successor? How do you maintain the dignity of ancient institutions when their occupant might require a feed bag rather than a toga? The very possibility poisoned the atmosphere of Roman governance, reducing every political discussion to a potential comedy routine orchestrated by a deranged deity. Meanwhile, the imperial treasury hemorrhaged gold at unprecedented rates. Caligula's building projects grew ever more grandiose and pointless. He constructed massive statues of himself throughout the empire, often replacing the heads of existing divine sculptures with his own features. In Rome, he began work on a pharaonic palace complex that would have dwarfed anything in Alexandria or Babylon. The dining rooms featured ceilings of fretted ivory that opened to shower guests with flower petals or perfumes. Mechanical devices rotated entire sections of the building to follow the sun's path across the sky. The emperor's personal habits consumed fortunes. His clothing was woven with threads of gold, his shoes were studded with gems, and he reportedly bathed in oils that cost more per ounce than silver. He traveled with an entourage of hundreds, including personal poets, musicians, masseurs, and food tasters for every meal. When he visited his villa at Antium, the entire imperial court relocated, requiring a logistical operation that bankrupted local communities along the route. By 40 CE, the financial strain was becoming impossible to ignore. The treasury surplus that Tiberius had accumulated through decades of careful budgeting vanished into Caligula's projects like water poured onto sand. Tax collectors received increasingly desperate instructions to squeeze more revenue from already overburdened provinces. New levies appeared monthly: taxes on lawsuits, on marriages, on divorce proceedings, on prostitution, on almost every conceivable human activity that involved the exchange of money. The emperor's response to fiscal crisis was characteristically theatrical. Rather than reducing expenditures, he announced new games, more ambitious building projects, and larger bonuses for the Praetorian Guard. When advisors dared suggest moderation, Caligula reminded them that Jupiter himself had never been constrained by mortal budgets. Divine emperors, he explained, created wealth through the sheer force of their will. The laws of economics, like the laws of physics, apparently bent before imperial divinity. Food shortages began appearing in Rome by late 40 CE. The complex supply chains that fed the world's largest city required careful management and substantial investment. Egyptian grain shipments, Spanish olive oil, and Gallic wine all cost money to transport and distribute. When those funds were diverted to gold-leafed horse stables and mechanical dining rooms, ordinary Romans found their bread rations shrinking and their wine watered down beyond recognition. The emperor seemed genuinely puzzled by popular complaints about hunger. From his perspective, surrounded by constant luxury and attended by servants who anticipated his every need, the idea of material want was literally incomprehensible. When riots broke out in the poorer districts of the city, Caligula's solution was to stage more elaborate games in the Circus Maximus, as if entertainment could substitute for nutrition. The crowds cheered the spectacles with hollow enthusiasm, their applause motivated more by fear than genuine pleasure. In the provinces, governors began sending increasingly frantic reports about local unrest and economic collapse. Military commanders complained that their troops were going unpaid, while the emperor spent their wages on theatrical bridges and shell-collecting expeditions. The delicate balance that held the empire together, provincial taxes funding military salaries, military strength ensuring provincial compliance, was breaking down under the pressure of imperial whimsy. The Praetorian Guard, traditionally the emperor's most reliable supporters, found themselves in an impossible position. Their oath bound them to protect Caligula's life, but their pragmatic instincts warned them that his reign was becoming unsustainable. These were professional soldiers, men who understood logistics and leadership and the basic requirements of effective governance. They watched their emperor declare war on mythological sea gods, while real barbarian tribes pressed against the frontier, and they began to have quiet conversations about alternative arrangements. The conspiracy that finally formed around Cassius Chaerea, a senior centurion of the Praetorian Guard, was motivated less by noble republican ideals than by simple practical necessity. Chaerea had endured months of personal humiliation from Caligula, who delighted in assigning him embarrassing passwords like Priapus and Venus, and mocking his high-pitched voice in front of other officers. But the deeper issue was professional. The Guard recognized that their emperor had become a threat to the stability of the empire they were sworn to protect. The assassination itself, when it finally came on January 24, 41 CE, was almost anticlimactic. After nearly 4 years of theatrical excess, Caligula died in a narrow corridor beneath the Palatine Palace, stabbed by men who had grown tired of pretending that madness was divine inspiration. There were no grand speeches, no noble appeals to republican virtue, just the practical violence of soldiers removing an obstacle to effective governance. The conspirators made sure to kill the emperor's wife and infant daughter as well, eliminating any possibility of dynastic continuity. They tossed the bodies into a shallow grave, unmarked and unadorned. After years of golden statues and marble temples dedicated to his divinity, Gaius Caligula ended as he had perhaps always been, a young man who had confused the symbols of power with power itself, and who had learned too late that even emperors cannot command the tides to obey their whims. Nero, pyromaniac with a lyre, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus became Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, through a combination of maternal ambition, political assassination, and adopted fortune that would have impressed even the most cynical Roman power broker. His mother, Julia Agrippina the Younger, possessed the ruthless intelligence of her bloodline. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, sister of Caligula, and wife of Emperor Claudius. More importantly, she understood that in the imperial household, survival often required eliminating potential threats before they recognized themselves as threats. The teenage Nero, who ascended to the throne in 54 CE, appeared to embody every Roman virtue his predecessor had lacked. Where Claudius had been scholarly and stuttering, Nero was handsome and articulate. Where the old emperor had seemed embarrassed by imperial ceremony, the young one embraced it with theatrical flair that made even seasoned courtiers catch their breath. His early speeches to the Senate, carefully crafted by his tutor Seneca, promised a return to Augustan principles, respect for traditional institutions, and collaborative governance that would heal the wounds left by decades of imperial caprice. For the first 5 years of his reign, Nero's promise seemed genuine. The administration ran smoothly under the guidance of Seneca and Sextus, Afranius Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, both men of proven competence who understood how to channel youthful imperial enthusiasm into productive governance. The emperor showed genuine interest in legal reform, sponsored public works projects that actually served civic purposes, and maintained the delicate balance between imperial authority and senatorial dignity that had eluded so many of his predecessors. But Agrippina had not maneuvered her son onto the throne merely to watch him become a competent administrator under other men's guidance. She expected to rule through him, to exercise the power that Roman tradition denied to women through the convenient fiction of maternal influence. Her presence loomed over every imperial decision, her approval sought for every major appointment, her displeasure feared more than that of the emperor himself. The conflict between mother and son began over the predictable issue of romantic autonomy. Nero had fallen desperately in love with Claudia Acte, a freed slave whose beauty and intelligence had captured his attention, but whose social status made her utterly unsuitable as an imperial consort. Agrippina viewed this infatuation as both personally insulting and politically dangerous. How could she maintain her position as the most important woman in the empire if her son preferred the company of a former slave? The confrontation escalated through 58 and 59 CE. Mother and son, maneuvering around each other with increasing desperation. Agrippina threatened to support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, as an alternative claimant to the throne. Nero responded by gradually stripping away his mother's honors and privileges, removing her Germanic bodyguard and limiting her access to the palace. The imperial court watched this family drama unfold with the fascinated horror of spectators at a gladiatorial match, understanding that the outcome would determine the empire's future direction. The resolution, when it came, shocked even Rome's violence-inured political class. In March of 59 CE, Nero invited his mother to reconcile at his villa in Baiae on the Bay of Naples. The reunion dinner proceeded with elaborate courtesy, son and mother exchanging gifts and pleasantries, as if their recent conflicts had been mere misunderstandings. Then Agrippina boarded the specially prepared ship that would carry her back across the bay to her own residence. The vessel had been designed to collapse in deep water, its hull fitted with concealed mechanisms that would open the seams and send it to the bottom with all hands. But either through engineering incompetence or divine intervention, the assassination attempt failed spectacularly. The ship broke apart as planned, but Agrippina proved to be a stronger swimmer than her son had anticipated. She made it to shore, waterlogged and furious, understanding exactly what had just happened. Nero's response to his mother's survival revealed the psychological transformation that would define the rest of his reign. Instead of attempting reconciliation or even plausible denial, he immediately dispatched a squad of sailors to finish the job with less subtle methods. They found Agrippina in her villa, still dripping seawater and demanding to see her son. According to the historian Tacitus, her final words were practical rather than dramatic. She pointed to her womb and told her killers, "Strike here first. The body that had carried the emperor deserved priority in destruction." The matricide liberated something dark and theatrical in Nero's character. Free from his mother's oversight and genuinely traumatized by what he had done, the young emperor threw himself into the pursuit of artistic excellence with manic intensity. He had always been drawn to performance singing, lyre playing, chariot racing, and theatrical declamation. But now these interests transformed from hobbies into obsessions that consumed his attention and the empire's resources. Nero's concerts became mandatory events for the Roman elite. Senators found themselves trapped in theaters for hours while their emperor performed his original compositions, elaborate musical dramas that combined classical themes with contemporary political commentary. The audience was forbidden to leave during performances, no matter how pressing their personal needs. Women reportedly gave birth in their seats, rather than risk insulting the imperial artist by departing. Men feigned death to escape, hoping to be carried out by sympathetic slaves, who understood the desperate lengths to which good Romans would go to avoid another encore. The emperor's artistic pretensions extended beyond music into athletics and chariot racing. He competed in the Olympic Games of 67 CE, winning every contest he entered through the simple expedient of being the only competitor judges dared to rule against. His chariot crashed during the race, throwing him from the vehicle and leaving him unable to finish, but he received the victory crown anyway. The official records showed 808 first-place victories for Nero across various competitions, a statistical impossibility that fooled nobody but apparently satisfied the imperial ego. Meanwhile, Rome itself was transforming under Nero's architectural vision. The emperor had inherited Augustus's boast about finding Rome brick and leaving it marble, but his own ambitions ran toward the fantastical. He envisioned a city rebuilt according to aesthetic principles rather than practical necessities, with broader streets, more beautiful buildings, and grand vistas that would make the capital worthy of its divine ruler's artistic sensibilities. The opportunity to realize this vision came with devastating suddenness on the night of July 1864 CE. Fire broke out in the shops around the Circus Maximus, in the area where the Aventine and Palatine hills came closest together. The flames spread with terrifying speed through the densely packed insulae, where Rome's poor lived in wooden tenements that might as well have been designed as kindling. The fire burned for 6 days and 7 nights, consuming 10 of the city's 14 districts and leaving hundreds of thousands of residents homeless. Nero was in Antium when the fire began. 35 miles from Rome, he rushed back to the city and immediately began organizing relief efforts, opening his own palaces to refugees and arranging for emergency food supplies from nearby provinces. His response was competent and compassionate, the kind of crisis leadership that Roman tradition celebrated in its greatest heroes. But somehow, in the popular imagination, the emperor's absence during the fire's first hours transformed into something more sinister. The story that emerged, almost certainly false but impossible to completely disprove, claimed that Nero had watched Rome burn while singing The Sack of Troy, his own musical composition about another great city's destruction. The image was too perfect for Roman gossip to resist. The artistic emperor transformed into a pyromaniac poet, composing epic verses while his capital went up in flames. Truth mattered less than narrative satisfaction, and the narrative of Nero The fire starter satisfied something deep in the Roman psyche's need for dramatic explanations. Whether or not Nero started the fire, he certainly took advantage of its aftermath. The burned districts were rebuilt according to his architectural vision, with wider streets, height restrictions on buildings, and more extensive use of stone and concrete. Most spectacular of all was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a vast palace complex that sprawled across the Palatine, Esquiline, and Caelian hills. The structure covered roughly 125 acres in the heart of Rome, featuring gardens, artificial lakes, and architectural innovations that pushed Roman engineering to its limits. The palace's dining rooms were mechanical marvels, ceilings open to shower guests with flower petals or perfume, walls rotated to display different artistic scenes. The main banquet hall was circular and revolved continuously, powered by hidden machinery that kept the room in constant motion day and night. Nero installed a colossal bronze statue of himself, 120 feet tall, in the palace's vestibule, a monument to imperial ego that could be seen from miles away. The Golden House's gardens featured exotic animals roaming freely through carefully landscaped parkland. Peacocks strutted across manicured lawns, while lions dozed in artificial grottos designed to resemble African veldt. The emperor kept elephants, giraffes, and rhinoceros in compounds that doubled as outdoor dining rooms, where guests could watch dangerous beasts while enjoying elaborate feasts. The artificial lake was large enough for naval battles between miniature fleets manned by gladiators dressed as Greeks and Trojans. But the palace's most notorious feature was its systematic integration of advanced bathing technology with imperial luxury. The baths featured seawater and sulfur water piped in from distant sources, pools heated to different temperatures, and massage rooms staffed by specialists trained in techniques from across the empire. Nero reportedly spent hours daily in these facilities, emerging pink and perfumed for evening entertainments that stretched until dawn. The financial cost of these projects was staggering. The Golden House alone consumed enough gold to outfit several legions, enough marble to build multiple temples, and enough labor to construct significant portions of new cities. Nero's response to budgetary constraints was characteristically theatrical. He increased taxes, debased the currency, and confiscated property from wealthy Romans accused of treason or conspiracy. The emperor's needs took precedence over the empire's fiscal stability, and anyone who questioned this priority risked being labeled an enemy of imperial artistic vision. The fire had provided Nero with another opportunity for theatrical gesture that would haunt his memory forever. With hundreds of thousands of Romans homeless and angry, he needed scapegoats for the disaster. The small Christian community in Rome provided perfect targets. They were unpopular, easily identifiable, and had no powerful protectors among the traditional elite. Nero's persecution of the Christians became legendary for its creative cruelty rather than its scale. The emperor turned Christian executions into evening entertainment in his palace gardens. Some victims were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by hunting dogs, while guests enjoyed outdoor dinners. Others were crucified along the garden paths, their dying agonies providing ambient atmosphere for imperial parties. Most notoriously, Christians were covered with pitch and set alight to serve as human torches, illuminating the palace grounds after dark. According to the historian Tacitus, even Romans accustomed to brutal public executions found these spectacles excessive. The Christians might be guilty of hatred of the human race, as their accusers claimed, but the manner of their deaths seemed to exceed any reasonable standard of justice. Nero's cruelty was becoming an entertainment in itself, divorced from any practical purpose beyond satisfying the emperor's taste for theatrical horror. The persecution established a template for later imperial campaigns against Christians, but it also marked a crucial shift in Nero's public image. He was no longer merely an eccentric artist with expensive tastes. He had become a figure of genuine menace, whose whims could destroy entire communities. The boundary between performance and reality, between artistic vision and actual violence, had dissolved completely in the emperor's mind. By 65 CE, the contradictions in Nero's reign were becoming unsustainable. The military, long neglected, while the emperor pursued his artistic interests, faced serious challenges on multiple frontiers. The Jewish revolt in Palestine required immediate attention and substantial resources. Parthian expansion in Armenia threatened Roman interests in the east. The Rhine frontier showed signs of barbarian pressure that could explode into full-scale war without proper management. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE brought together senators, knights, and even Praetorian officers who had concluded that Nero's reign posed a fundamental threat to imperial stability. The plot was extensive and well-funded, with tentacles reaching into every level of Roman society. Its failure resulted not from lack of support, but from the simple bad luck of premature discovery by an overzealous slave seeking reward money. Nero's response to the conspiracy revealed how completely paranoia had consumed his thinking. The trials and executions that followed swept up dozens of Rome's most distinguished families, including the philosopher Seneca, the poet Lucan, and the elegant Petronius, author of the Satyricon. The emperor seemed to take particular pleasure in forcing his former friends and advisors to commit suicide, allowing them the traditional Roman privilege of choosing their own death rather than facing public execution. The suicides became elaborate performances themselves. Seneca opened his veins in a warm bath, dictating final philosophical observations to his secretaries, while his life slowly drained away. Petronius composed witty verses, mocking Nero's artistic pretensions, reading them aloud to dinner guests before opening his wrists between courses. The emperor's reign had become so theatrical that even death took on the character of dramatic performance. In the provinces, revolt erupted with increasing frequency. The Jewish war drained resources and manpower while producing no clear victories. Gallic tribes began showing signs of unrest, reminiscent of the Great Rebellion under Julius Caesar. Most ominously, army commanders in Spain and Gaul declared their independence from imperial authority, proclaiming alternative claimants to the throne and marching on Rome itself. The end, when it came in June of 68 CE, was almost farcical in its haste and confusion. Nero fled Rome ahead of approaching rebel armies, accompanied by only a handful of loyal slaves and freedmen. He took refuge in a villa outside the city, spending his final hours composing verses about his own approaching death and practicing declamatory speeches he would never get to deliver. When the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Praetorian cavalry, he pressed a dagger to his throat and gasped his final words, "What an artist dies in me." Even in death, Nero remained a performer, crafting his exit line for maximum dramatic effect. The empire he left behind was bankrupt, rebellious, and exhausted by 14 years of theatrical governance. His golden house was stripped of its treasures and partially demolished to make room for more practical buildings. The artificial lake became the site of the Colosseum, where future emperors would provide entertainment for the masses without bankrupting the state. Yet somehow Nero's memory refused to die with his body. For decades afterward, pretenders appeared in the eastern provinces, claiming to be the artist emperor returned from exile. The common people, who had suffered under his misrule but retained fond memories of his spectacular games, seemed willing to believe that their flamboyant tormentor might someday return to burn another city and build another golden palace. Even in death, Nero remained what he had always been, the greatest show Rome had ever seen. Tiberius Claudius Nero Caesar had never wanted to be emperor. This simple fact, more than any character flaw or psychological defect, perhaps explains the peculiar horror of his 23-year reign and his final voluntary exile to the island of Capri. When Augustus reluctantly adopted him as heir after the deaths of his preferred successors, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, the 50-year-old Tiberius accepted imperial destiny with the grim resignation of a man walking to his own execution. For the first 8 years of his reign, Tiberius governed with competent efficiency that bordered on the obsessive. He personally reviewed legal cases that previous emperors had delegated to subordinates, maintained careful oversight of provincial administration, and managed the imperial finances with a parsimony that rebuilt the treasury reserves depleted by Augustus's final building projects. The Senate found him respectful of traditional prerogatives. The army discovered him generous with bonuses and attentive to frontier security, and the Roman people appreciated his restraint in staging games and spectacles. But competence, Tiberius learned, was not enough to satisfy the complex political chemistry of imperial Rome. The emperor needed to be visible, accessible, and charismatic in ways that violated his essentially private nature. Every public appearance became an ordeal of forced smiles and carefully rehearsed gestures. Every senatorial meeting required him to perform enthusiasm for policies he privately considered routine administrative necessities. The gap between his natural temperament and his official role created a psychological tension that manifested itself in increasingly erratic behavior. The catalyst for complete transformation came in 23 CE, with the death of his son Drusus, not from battle or accident, but from poison administered by Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect whom Tiberius trusted more than any living person. The discovery of this betrayal 3 years later shattered something fundamental in the emperor's psyche. If Sejanus, his closest advisor and friend, had been systematically murdering imperial family members while maintaining perfect loyalty in daily interactions, then trust itself became impossible. Every smile concealed treachery. Every gesture of respect masked conspiracy. Every expression of friendship disguised assassination plots. In 26 CE, Tiberius announced his temporary withdrawal from Rome to inspect imperial estates in Campania. The inspection tour, ostensibly lasting a few weeks, became permanent exile. He established his residence at Villa Jovis on Capri, a spectacular palace complex perched on the island's highest cliffs, commanding views of the entire Bay of Naples. From this fortress of solitude, he would govern the Roman Empire for the remaining 11 years of his reign, never again setting foot on the Italian mainland. The villa itself was a masterpiece of imperial architecture adapted to psychological withdrawal. Built on multiple terraces carved into the cliff face, it featured reception halls that could accommodate formal imperial business while providing private quarters where the emperor could disappear completely from public view. The most remarkable feature was a network of private walkways and concealed staircases that allowed Tiberius to move through the complex without being seen by visitors, servants, or even his own bodyguards. The emperor's daily routine on Capri became the subject of endless speculation and progressively more horrific rumors. He would rise before dawn to read dispatch summaries prepared by his secretaries, dictate responses to the most pressing correspondence, and conduct brief audiences with the handful of senators and administrators who made the journey from Rome. But these official duties occupied only a fraction of his day. The remaining hours disappeared into private activities that fueled the darkest gossip in the empire's history. The stories that filtered back to Rome spoke of systematic cruelty disguised as entertainment. Tiberius allegedly maintained a collection of young boys and girls, acquired from across the empire, and trained in elaborate sexual performances for his amusement. The emperor reportedly forced these children to dress as nymphs and fauns, chasing them through the villa's gardens while he played the role of lustful Pan. The games concluded, according to whispered accounts, with violence that left participants permanently maimed or dead. More disturbing were the tales of what Romans called the little fishes, children trained to swim in the emperor's private pools and grottos, performing underwater sexual acts while Tiberius watched from hidden vantages. The youngest participants, some allegedly no more than infants, were taught to nibble and suck at the emperor's body while he reclined in warm seawater baths carved directly into Capri's coastal rocks. These activities supposedly took place in artificial caves illuminated by oil lamps, creating underwater theaters where innocence was systematically destroyed for imperial pleasure. The historical accuracy of these accounts remains disputed, but their circulation throughout the empire was undeniable and devastating to imperial authority. Whether or not Tiberius actually committed the crimes described, his isolation on Capri made denial impossible and confirmation unnecessary. The emperor's physical absence from Rome created a vacuum that filled itself with the darkest possible interpretations of his character and conduct. From his clifftop exile, Tiberius governed through an increasingly elaborate network of spies, informers, and secret police. The system, known as the delatores, transformed ordinary citizens into potential intelligence assets while making normal social interaction dangerous for anyone with imperial connections. Dinner party conversations could be reported to imperial agents as evidence of seditious conspiracy. Letters between friends might be intercepted and analyzed for treasonous content. Even family discussions became potential sources of criminal charges if overheard by servants hoping to profit from information. The treason trials that resulted from this surveillance apparatus consumed Rome's aristocratic class with methodical efficiency. Senators found themselves accused based on private conversations reported by slaves, divorced wives, or business rivals seeking to eliminate competition. The charges were typically vague, diminishing imperial dignity, or consulting astrologers about the emperor's health, but the consequences were brutally specific. Conviction meant death, confiscation of property, and the legal extinction of entire family lines. Tiberius conducted these trials by correspondence, reviewing evidence and issuing verdicts without ever seeing the accused face to face. His letters to the Senate became instruments of terror, each one potentially containing death sentences for multiple Roman citizens. The emperor's secretaries developed a formulaic style for these communications, beginning with conventional diplomatic pleasantries before transitioning into accusations of treason that seemed to arrive randomly, like lightning strikes on clear days. The most psychologically devastating aspect of this system was its apparent arbitrariness. Tiberius showed no consistent pattern in selecting targets, no clear ideology beyond paranoid self-preservation. A senator might survive public criticism of imperial policy while being executed for failing to attend a minor religious ceremony. Another might escape obvious treason charges while dying for an indiscreet joke overheard at the baths. The unpredictability was itself a form of terror, making every Roman aristocrat constantly aware that survival depended on the unknowable whims of an invisible emperor. The emperor's physical deterioration during his Capri years became the subject of medical fascination and political speculation. Visitors who managed audiences reported that Tiberius's face was covered with running sores that he attempted to conceal with bandages and medicinal plasters. His body odor was reportedly so offensive that servants could barely remain in closed rooms with him for extended periods. Whether these symptoms reflected specific diseases, the side effects of attempted poisonings, or simply the physical manifestation of psychological decay, remained unclear. More disturbing were the behavioral changes that accompanied his physical decline. Tiberius developed a compulsive need to watch executions, either in person when prisoners were brought to Capri, or through detailed written reports when the killings took place in Rome. He allegedly kept illustrated books depicting various torture methods and execution techniques, studying them with the intensity of a scholar reviewing philosophical texts. His correspondence with provincial governors increasingly focused on punishment protocols and the technical details of inflicting maximum pain before death. The emperor's relationship with Caligula, his great-nephew and eventual successor, became a source of particular fascination for contemporary observers. The young man spent several years on Capri as Tiberius's designated heir, witnessing daily life in the imperial villa and presumably learning the practical skills of governing an empire. What exactly Caligula saw and experienced during this period remained forever sealed by imperial discretion, but the psychological damage was evident in his subsequent reign. According to later historians, Tiberius recognized Caligula's fundamental unfitness for imperial responsibility, but viewed this instability as a form of divine justice. The Roman people deserved to suffer under a mad emperor as punishment for their corruption and decadence. He allegedly told confidants that he was nursing a viper for the Roman people, and that Caligula would destroy himself and everyone else after ascending to power. This prophecy, whether authentic or fabricated by later chroniclers, suggested that Tiberius had consciously chosen to inflict his disturbed great-nephew on the empire as an act of posthumous revenge. The villa's most notorious architectural feature was a sheer cliff known as the Tiberius Leap, where the emperor supposedly hurled visitors who displeased him during audiences. The drop was approximately 10 feet into jagged rocks and churning seawater below, ensuring that no victim could survive the fall. According to whispered accounts, Tiberius would conduct normal conversations with guests on the cliffside terraces, then suddenly signal to his bodyguards when a particular comment or expression triggered his displeasure. The condemned would be seized and thrown over the edge, while the emperor continued his discussion with remaining visitors as if nothing had happened. Soldiers stationed at the base of the cliffs were instructed to ensure that anyone who survived the initial fall did not live long enough to swim to safety. They used boat hooks and clubs to finish off broken bodies in the surf, creating a literal killing ground where imperial whim translated immediately into death. The system's efficiency reportedly delighted Tiberius, who appreciated that executions could be completed within minutes of his decision, without the tedious formalities of trials or legal proceedings. The emperor's correspondence during his final years revealed a mind increasingly disconnected from practical governance and obsessed with settling personal scores from decades past. He would spend hours dictating letters about perceived slights from his youth, ordering posthumous punishments for the descendants of men who had supposedly insulted him 50 years earlier. His secretaries learned to humor these ramblings while quietly filing the more extreme commands in boxes that would never be opened. Understanding that their emperor was no longer entirely rational, Tiberius's death in March of 37 CE became itself a source of macabre speculation and political intrigue. The official account described a peaceful passing after brief illness, with the emperor surrounded by loyal advisors and attended by competent physicians. But alternative versions suggested that Caligula had smothered the dying emperor with pillows, either from impatience to assume power or from mercy for a man whose suffering had become unbearable to witness. The most dramatic account claimed that Tiberius had actually begun recovering from his final illness, sitting up in bed and calling for food after days of apparent unconsciousness. Caligula, already proclaimed emperor by hasty courtiers, allegedly panicked at the prospect of his predecessor's survival and personally pressed a pillow over the old man's face until breathing stopped. Whether this version contained any truth mattered less than its psychological plausibility. Everyone who knew both men could imagine the scene unfolding exactly as described. The emperor's funeral in Rome became a cathartic celebration disguised as mourning ceremony. Crowds lined the streets, shouting, "To the Tiber with Tiberius," and demanding that his body be thrown into the river rather than honored with traditional cremation rites. The Senate initially proposed formal deification, but popular opposition was so intense that the motion was quietly withdrawn. Instead, Tiberius received perfunctory obsequies, while Romans celebrated their liberation from 23 years of paranoid tyranny. The Villa Jovis on Capri was immediately abandoned after Tiberius's death, as if the building itself had been contaminated by its association with imperial cruelty. Caligula ordered the removal of all portable valuables, but left the structure itself to decay in the Mediterranean sun. Within decades, local fishermen were using the emperor's reception halls as boat storage and his private chambers as goat pens, completing the transformation from imperial palace to rural ruins. Yet the psychological legacy of Tiberius's reign extended far beyond the physical destruction of his monuments. He had demonstrated that competent administration could coexist with systematic cruelty, that an emperor could govern effectively while remaining almost entirely invisible to his subjects, and that the Roman system provided no meaningful checks on imperial behavior once traditional restraints were abandoned. His example would inspire later tyrants who learned to combine administrative efficiency with creative sadism, understanding that Rome's vast size and complex bureaucracy could accommodate almost any level of imperial excess, as long as basic governmental functions continued operating. The whispered stories from Capri became part of Roman collective memory, cautionary tales about what happened when absolute power was exercised by someone who had never wanted it in the first place. Tiberius had revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the imperial system. The emperor needed to be simultaneously divine and human, visible and remote, accessible and awesome. His failure to resolve this contradiction had created a reign of competent terror that satisfied nobody while traumatizing everyone. ELAGABALUS perfume, PEACOCKS, raining rose petals. In the summer of 218 CE, a 14-year-old Syrian priest named Varius Avitus Bassianus stood before the legions of the eastern frontier and proclaimed himself the rightful Roman emperor. The boy had never seen Rome, spoke Latin with a heavy accent, and worshipped a god whose name most Romans couldn't pronounce correctly. Yet within months, he would control the world's greatest empire and transform it into the stage for the most spectacular religious and sexual theater in ancient history. The youth who would become Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, though history remembers him by his religious title Elagabalus, owed his elevation to the ruthless ambition of his grandmother, Julia Maesa, and the desperate loyalty of Syrian legions who had grown tired of the military emperor Macrinus. The women of the Severan dynasty understood power in ways that transcended traditional Roman categories, and they recognized that the boy's exotic priesthood and striking beauty could be transformed into political weapons more effective than conventional armies. Elagabalus arrived in Rome in the autumn of 219 CE, riding in a chariot drawn by white horses and accompanied by a procession that resembled a religious festival more than an imperial triumph. He wore the elaborate silk robes and golden ornaments of his priesthood, his eyes rimmed with kohl and his lips painted crimson in the Syrian fashion. The crowd that gathered to witness their new emperor's arrival saw something unprecedented in Roman history: a teenage god-king who embodied Eastern mystery religions rather than traditional Latin virtues. The emperor's first official act was to install the sacred black stone of Elagabal in a magnificent temple constructed on the Palatine Hill, directly across from the ancient shrine of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. The meteorite, which Syrian tradition identified as the physical manifestation of their sun god, was transported from a mesa in a silver chariot, attended by dancing priests and musicians, playing exotic instruments that produced sounds never before heard in the Roman Forum. The installation ceremony lasted 3 days and included sacrifices of hundreds of cattle, sheep, and exotic animals imported specifically for the occasion. The theological implications of this innovation were staggering. Elagabalus wasn't simply adding another foreign deity to Rome's already crowded pantheon. He was explicitly establishing his Syrian god as supreme over all traditional Roman divinities. Jupiter himself was reduced to a subordinate position, forced to share temple space with a black rock that most Romans viewed as primitive idol worship. The emperor compounded the insult by announcing his intention to marry his god to various Roman goddesses, creating divine unions that violated both religious tradition and basic theological logic. But religious innovation was only the beginning of Elagabalus's assault on Roman sensibilities. The teenage emperor had spent his formative years in a Syrian court, where gender boundaries were fluid and sexual experimentation was considered normal for aristocratic youth. He brought these attitudes to the Roman palace, where they collided spectacularly with traditional Latin expectations about masculine behavior and imperial dignity. Within months of his arrival, Elagabalus had scandalized Rome by marrying Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin whose sacred oath of celibacy was considered fundamental to the city's spiritual protection. The marriage was both religiously impossible. Vestals who broke their vows were traditionally buried alive, and politically disastrous, suggesting that the emperor cared nothing for the religious traditions that supposedly legitimized his rule. His justification for the union combined theological innovation with adolescent grandiosity. The marriage would produce divine children who would rule both heaven and earth. The Vestal marriage lasted less than a year, dissolved when political pressure became overwhelming, but it established a pattern of matrimonial experimentation that would characterize the emperor's entire reign. ELAGABALUS collected spouses with the enthusiasm of other rulers collecting provinces, marrying and divorcing with a frequency that made legal scholars throw up their hands in despair. His brides included aristocratic Roman women, foreign princesses, former slaves, and at least one male charioteer whom he elevated to the status of Caesar before the union was hastily annulled under Senate pressure. The emperor's gender presentation became increasingly fluid as his confidence grew and his advisors' influence waned. He appeared in public, wearing women's clothing, cosmetics, and jewelry that would have been considered excessive even for Roman matrons. Court ceremonies featured the emperor receiving guests while dressed as Venus or Cybele, his body adorned with silk robes, pearl necklaces, and golden bracelets that caught the light and created an almost supernatural shimmer around his movements. More controversially, ELAGABALUS allegedly sought surgical transformation to complete his feminine presentation. Ancient sources claim he consulted with physicians about procedures to create female genitalia, offering enormous rewards to any doctor who could accomplish such surgery successfully. Whether these accounts reflect actual attempts at gender reassignment or merely represent hostile propaganda remains debated by modern historians, but the stories became integral to contemporary understanding of the emperor's character. The imperial household itself was transformed into something resembling a sacred brothel rather than a traditional court. ELAGABALUS surrounded himself with young men and women, selected primarily for their beauty and sexual availability, creating a constantly shifting entourage of lovers, companions, and religious attendants, whose roles often overlapped in ways that shocked even worldly Roman observers. Palace ceremonies combined state functions with religious rituals and erotic performances that blurred every traditional boundary between sacred and profane, public and private, political and personal. The emperor's banquets became legendary for their extravagance and creative excess. Guests reclined on couches scattered with rose petals that were replenished throughout the evening by teams of servants carrying baskets of flowers imported from across the empire. The ceiling featured mechanical devices that could shower diners with additional petals, perfumes, or even small gifts, while they ate courses prepared by chefs trained in cuisines from Parthia to Britain. But ELAGABALUS's most notorious innovation was the incorporation of living animals into his dining entertainment. Peacocks wandered freely through the dining hall, their tail feathers creating moving tapestries of color that shifted with each bird's movement. Flamingos stood in shallow pools around the room's perimeter, their pink reflections doubling in polished marble surfaces. More dramatically, lions and leopards on golden chains were led through the banquet area, their presence creating thrills of terror and excitement among guests who never knew whether the animals were completely tamed or merely temporarily controlled. The financial cost of these spectacles consumed imperial resources at an unprecedented rate. A single banquet might cost more than the annual salary of an entire legion, with expenses including not only exotic foods and imported delicacies, but also the transportation and maintenance of animals, the training of specialized servants, and the constant renovation of palace spaces to accommodate new forms of entertainment. The emperor's clothing budget alone exceeded the gross domestic product of some provinces, as Syrian silk traders and Roman jewelers competed to create ever more elaborate costumes for imperial appearances. ELAGABALUS's religious innovations proved equally expensive and infinitely more controversial. He established new priesthoods, built additional temples, and instituted festival cycles that required constant public ceremonies and massive animal sacrifices. The emperor himself performed many of these rituals, dancing before the sacred stone, while wearing robes that weighed hundreds of pounds, and performing symbolic acts that combined Syrian religious traditions with his own improvised theatrical elements. The most spectacular of these ceremonies was the annual sacred marriage between ELAGABAL and various Roman deities, represented by their cult statues and sacred objects. The emperor would process through the city in a chariot pulled by white horses, followed by the sacred stone mounted on its own silver vehicle, while thousands of priests, musicians, and dancers created a mobile religious festival that consumed entire days and brought normal civic life to a complete halt. The Syrian god's union with Minerva, goddess of wisdom, involved elaborate ceremonies in which the emperor, dressed as a bride, performed symbolic sexual acts with the goddess's statue, while priests chanted prayers in languages most Romans couldn't understand. The theological implications were staggering. Roman deities were being subordinated to foreign gods through mystical marriages that violated every traditional understanding of divine relationships and religious propriety. The emperor's personal involvement in these ceremonies went far beyond conventional imperial participation in religious functions. Elagabalus actively served as a priest, handling sacred objects, performing ritual dances, and entering states of religious ecstasy that contemporary observers described as either divine inspiration or obvious mental illness. He would spend hours in temple complexes, emerging with cryptic pronouncements about divine revelations that were supposed to guide imperial policy, but usually reflected the emperor's personal obsessions more than practical governance considerations. The administrative chaos that resulted from Elagabalus's priorities became increasingly obvious as his reign progressed. Important provincial dispatches went unanswered, while the emperor focused on planning religious festivals. Military commanders received contradictory orders, filtered through priests who had no understanding of tactical necessities. The Senate found itself consulted on theological questions while being excluded from discussions about taxation, public works, and frontier security. The breaking point came when Elagabalus announced his intention to relocate the entire imperial administration to Syria, transforming Emesa into the new capital of the Roman Empire. The plan involved moving not only the government bureaucracy, but also Rome's most sacred religious objects, including the Palladium of Troy and the eternal flame of Vesta. The emperor proclaimed that all roads should lead to Emesa rather than Rome, and that the Syrian city would become the center of a new world order based on the worship of Elagabal rather than traditional Roman values. This proposal unified opposition against the emperor in ways that his sexual scandals and religious innovations had failed to achieve. Even Romans who could tolerate exotic imperial behavior drew the line at abandoning the city that had given the empire its name and identity. The Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the imperial bureaucracy recognized that Elagabalus's plan represented not merely another eccentric gesture, but an existential threat to Roman civilization itself. The conspiracy that formed against the emperor was led by his own grandmother, Julia Maessa, who had engineered his rise to power but now recognized that his behavior threatened the entire Severan dynasty. She began promoting Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's younger cousin, as an alternative heir who could preserve family control while returning to more traditional forms of imperial conduct. The campaign was subtle but systematic, emphasizing Alexander's Roman education, his respect for traditional values, and his masculine presentation that contrasted sharply with Elagabalus's gender fluidity. The final confrontation came in March of 222 CE, when Praetorian guards surrounded the imperial palace and demanded that Elagabalus abdicate in favor of his cousin. The 18-year-old emperor, faced with military revolt and family betrayal, attempted to flee but was captured in the palace latrines where he had hidden with his mother. The guards killed both immediately, reportedly with such violence that their bodies were barely recognizable when the butchery ended. The conspirators threw Elagabalus's corpse into the Tiber River after dragging it through the streets of Rome, ensuring that he would receive no proper burial rites and that his spirit would be denied peaceful rest in the afterlife. His religious innovations were immediately dismantled. His temples were destroyed or converted to traditional Roman purposes, and his name was systematically erased from public inscriptions in the first comprehensive attempt at historical damnatio memoriae since the reign of Domitian. Yet somehow the memory of Elagabalus proved impossible to completely suppress. The stories of his reign became part of Roman folklore, cautionary tales about what happened when Eastern decadence was allowed to corrupt traditional Latin virtues. But they also represented something else. A brief moment when the rigid categories of Roman civilization had been challenged by someone who refused to accept conventional boundaries between male and female, sacred and profane, Roman and foreign, possible and impossible. Commodus Gladiator, god of the Colosseum. Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus was born into the greatest philosophical dynasty in Roman history, heir to an emperor who wrote meditations on virtue and cosmic harmony while campaigning on the frozen Danube frontier. Yet, by the time of his father's death in 180 CE, the 18-year-old prince had already revealed appetites and obsessions that would transform him into perhaps the most theatrically self-indulgent ruler in imperial history. A man who believed his destiny was to entertain himself, while the Roman world provided an endless audience for his increasingly bizarre performances. The young Commodus, who assumed sole imperial power after Marcus Aurelius's death, appeared to embody every Roman martial ideal his philosopher father had celebrated in private writings. He was physically magnificent, standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and narrow waist of a trained athlete. His golden hair caught Mediterranean sunlight in a way that reminded observers of classical statues depicting youthful gods, and his voice carried the natural authority that Roman tradition associated with divine kingship. More importantly, he possessed genuine skill with weapons and had demonstrated personal courage in the Germanic campaigns that occupied the final years of his father's reign. For the first few years, Commodus governed with competent attention to imperial responsibilities, guided by advisors who had served Marcus Aurelius and understood the delicate balance required to maintain Roman power across 3 continents. The new emperor completed his father's military campaigns, signed advantageous peace treaties with Germanic tribes, and returned to Rome for a triumph that satisfied both popular expectations and senatorial dignity. He showed appropriate reverence for traditional institutions, consulted regularly with experienced administrators, and seemed to understand that imperial power required constant attention to practical details rather than mere ceremonial display. But somewhere during those early years, perhaps influenced by the intoxicating adulation that surrounded every imperial appearance, Commodus began to develop a conception of his role that diverged dramatically from his father's Stoic philosophy. Where Marcus Aurelius had viewed imperial power as a burden to be carried with resignation and wisdom, his son discovered it as an opportunity for self-expression and personal gratification on a scale that no private citizen could ever imagine. The empire existed to serve the emperor's pleasure, not the other way around, and Commodus intended to explore every possibility that absolute power might provide. The transformation became obvious through his growing obsession with gladiatorial combat and arena spectacles. What began as conventional imperial attendance at games evolved into personal participation that shocked even Rome's violence-inured population. Commodus didn't merely watch gladiators fight. He insisted on entering the arena himself, dressed in elaborate costumes and wielding weapons crafted specifically for imperial hands. These weren't symbolic appearances or carefully choreographed demonstrations of royal courage. The emperor genuinely wanted to kill people for public entertainment, and he possessed both the skill and the legal authority to make this fantasy reality. His first arena appearances involved combat against wild animals rather than human opponents, allowing him to demonstrate martial prowess while avoiding the political complications that might arise from imperial participation in gladiatorial matches between men. Commodus proved remarkably effective at hunting lions, leopards, and bears, using javelins, bows, and spears with accuracy that impressed even professional beast hunters. He reportedly killed over 10 animals during his career as an arena performer, developing techniques and strategies that were studied and imitated by gladiatorial trainers throughout the empire. But animal hunting, however spectacular, couldn't satisfy the emperor's growing appetite for more intense forms of arena combat. By the mid-180s CE, Commodus had begun fighting against human opponents, initially condemned criminals and captured barbarians who were given weapons but no real chance of victory. These matches were theatrical exercises in imperial dominance, allowing the emperor to demonstrate his superiority over Rome's enemies, while providing crowds with the unique spectacle of watching their ruler personally execute justice. The logical progression led inevitably to combat against actual gladiators, professional fighters whose skills had been honed through years of training and arena experience. These matches required elaborate precautions to ensure imperial safety while maintaining the appearance of genuine competition. Commodus's opponents were typically given blunted weapons or were secretly weakened through drug-laced food and drink before the contests began. The emperor himself wore specially constructed armor that provided protection without obvious visibility, and the arena sand was carefully prepared to cushion falls that might otherwise prove fatal. Even with these safeguards, Commodus's gladiatorial career involved genuine risk and demonstrated considerable personal skill. He developed his own fighting style, combining classical Roman military techniques with innovations borrowed from various gladiatorial schools. His preferred weapons were the sword and net, allowing him to display both offensive aggression and defensive agility in ways that maximized dramatic effect while minimizing actual danger. The emperor trained regularly with Rome's finest gladiatorial instructors, approaching combat preparation with the same intensity that his father had devoted to philosophical study. The financial cost of staging these imperial exhibitions was staggering. Each appearance required weeks of preparation, involving not only the emperor's personal training, but also elaborate stage management to ensure that every detail contributed to the desired theatrical effect. Costumes were woven with gold thread and decorated with precious stones that caught arena lighting. Weapons were crafted by master smiths who understood that their work would be scrutinized by thousands of spectators and recorded by historians for future generations. The arena itself was redecorated for each imperial performance, with new scenic elements, exotic plants, and mechanical devices that could produce spectacular effects on cue. The crowds that attended these spectacles represented every level of Roman society, from senators and knights in premium seating to slaves and freedmen packed into the upper tiers. Admission was typically free for imperial performances, with the emperor personally funding not only the entertainment, but also elaborate distributions of food, wine, and small gifts to ensure maximum popular enthusiasm. These events became civic holidays that lasted for days, combining gladiatorial combat with theatrical performances, chariot races, and public feasts that consumed entire districts of the city. But Commodus's arena obsession represented only one aspect of his broader campaign to reshape imperial identity according to his personal fantasies and ambitions. He began systematically renaming Roman institutions, geographical features, and calendar months to reflect his own glory and divine status. The city of Rome itself was rechristened Colonia Commodiana, while the Roman people became Commodiani, and the legions were designated Commodiani. September through December were renamed to honor various aspects of his character and achievements, creating a calendar that would remind future generations of his unprecedented greatness. The emperor's conception of his own divinity evolved from conventional imperial cult worship into something approaching monotheism, with Commodus as the sole deity worthy of genuine reverence. He identified himself with Hercules, commissioning statues and paintings that depicted him wearing the lion's skin and carrying the club associated with that mythological hero. But this identification went beyond mere artistic symbolism. Commodus genuinely believed that he possessed Hercules' divine strength, and that his arena victories demonstrated supernatural power rather than simply superior training. Equipment. The imperial palace was transformed into a shrine dedicated to this new form of emperor worship, with elaborate ceremonies that combined traditional Roman religious elements with innovations borrowed from mystery cults and Eastern religions. Commodus served as his own high priest, conducting daily rituals that supposedly maintained cosmic harmony while demonstrating his unique relationship with divine powers. Court ceremonies became religious services in which senators and high officials were required to participate as worshippers rather than advisors, fundamentally altering the relationship between emperor and aristocracy. The emperor's private life during this period was characterized by excess that exceeded even Roman standards for imperial self-indulgence. He maintained a harem of 300 concubines, selected from across the empire for their beauty and exotic appeal, housed in palace quarters that resembled luxurious brothels more than traditional imperial residences. These women were expected to be constantly available for the emperor's pleasure, participating in elaborate sexual performances that combined entertainment with gratification in ways that transformed private appetite into public spectacle. Commodus's sexual interests extended beyond conventional heterosexual relationships to include both male lovers and more exotic arrangements that scandalized even worldly Roman observers. He allegedly maintained relationships with gladiators, actors, and other social inferiors whose low status made their intimacy with the emperor both politically dangerous and personally degrading. These relationships violated fundamental Roman assumptions about masculine behavior and imperial dignity, suggesting that Commodus cared nothing for traditional aristocratic values or social boundaries. The emperor's daily schedule during his later years reflected complete abdication of governmental responsibilities in favor of personal gratification and arena preparation. He would typically rise late in the morning, spend several hours in elaborate bathing rituals attended by skilled masseurs and cosmetic specialists, then devote the afternoon to gladiatorial training or hunting expeditions in private game preserves stocked with exotic animals. Evenings were reserved for banquets, sexual encounters, or theatrical performances in which he played starring roles before audiences of terrified courtiers who dared not express anything but enthusiastic approval. Meanwhile, the practical business of governing the Roman Empire was delegated to freedmen and slaves who understood that their authority derived entirely from imperial favor and could be revoked at any moment. These administrative substitutes lacked both the social status and political experience necessary for effective governance, creating opportunities for corruption and incompetence that gradually undermined imperial efficiency throughout the provinces. Military commanders, provincial governors, and local administrators found themselves receiving contradictory instructions from officials who had no understanding of practical requirements or long-term strategic considerations. The emperor's financial policies during this period reflected the same theatrical self-indulgence that characterized his personal behavior. Imperial resources were systematically diverted from useful public works and military necessities to fund arena spectacles, palace renovations, and elaborate ceremonies celebrating Commodus's divine status. The emperor sold imperial appointments and provincial commands to the highest bidders, creating a formal market in governmental positions that normalized corruption while depleting the treasury of funds needed for frontier defense and urban infrastructure. By the early 190s CE, the contradictions inherent in Commodus's reign had created multiple crises that threatened imperial stability. Military discipline was breaking down as soldiers lost confidence in commanders who had purchased their positions rather than earning them through competence and experience. Provincial administration was increasingly inefficient as governors focused on recovering their investment in office purchases rather than maintaining effective local government. Most dangerous of all, the emperor's arena obsession was consuming so much time and resources that genuine threats to Roman security were being ignored or handled by subordinates who lacked authority to make crucial decisions. The conspiracy that finally developed against Commodus brought together praetorian prefects, palace servants, and even members of the emperor's own household, who had concluded that his reign posed an existential threat to imperial survival. The plot was motivated less by political ideology than by practical desperation. The empire simply could not continue functioning under a ruler who cared more about his arena performance than about barbarian invasions, urban riots, or provincial rebellions. The assassination itself, when it came on New Year's Eve, 192 CE, was accomplished through poison administered by Marcia, one of the emperor's favorite concubines, followed by strangulation in his bath by Narcissus, an athlete who possessed the physical strength necessary to overpower even Commodus's impressive physique. The emperor, who had spent years killing others for entertainment, died quietly in private, without an audience to applaud his final performance or record his last words for posterity. His body was secretly disposed of, and the Senate immediately began the process of damnatio memoriae that would erase his name from public monuments and official records. The gladiator emperor's death marked the end of the Antonine dynasty and initiated the chaotic year of the 5 emperors that would demonstrate how completely Commodus's theatrical reign had undermined the institutional foundations of Roman governance. His legacy was a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal obsession to replace public responsibility, but it was also something more troubling proof that absolute power could transform even philosophically educated rulers into monsters who viewed human suffering as entertainment and imperial authority as an opportunity for unlimited self-gratification. Justinian II, the slit-nose, returnee. When Justinian II first ascended the Byzantine throne in 685 CE at the age of 16, he embodied the imperial dreams and theological ambitions that had made Constantinople the heir to both Roman greatness and Christian universal monarchy. The young emperor possessed the intellectual brilliance of his grandfather, Constans II, combined with military instincts that promised to restore Byzantine power after decades of Arab conquests and internal religious conflicts. His early reforms demonstrated administrative competence and strategic vision that impressed even skeptical court officials who had grown accustomed to imperial mediocrity and dynastic decline. The empire that Justinian II inherited was a shadow of its former glory, reduced to Anatolia, the Balkans, and scattered territories in Italy and North Africa, while Arab armies controlled Syria, Egypt, and much of the former Roman East. The imperial treasury was chronically empty. The military was demoralized by constant defeats, and religious controversies over iconoclasm had divided the church and weakened imperial authority throughout the remaining provinces. Yet the young emperor approached these challenges with confidence that bordered on arrogance, convinced that divine favor and imperial determination could restore Byzantine greatness within a single generation. His initial policies focused on financial reform and military reorganization, implementing tax collection methods that were efficient but ruthlessly extractive. Justinian II understood that imperial survival depended on maximizing revenue from a shrinking territorial base, and he appointed tax collectors who prioritized results over popularity or traditional exemptions. Provincial aristocrats found their estates assessed at unprecedented levels, while urban merchants faced new levies on commercial transactions that had previously been considered too politically dangerous to tax directly. The emperor's religious policies were equally aggressive and far more controversial, reflecting his belief that theological uniformity was essential for imperial stability and divine blessing. He convened the Quinisext Council in 692 CE, attempting to resolve doctrinal disputes and establish canonical standards that would bind both Eastern and Western Christianity under imperial authority. The council's decrees challenged papal prerogatives and Western liturgical practices, creating ecclesiastical conflicts that undermined Justinian's efforts to restore imperial unity through religious conformity. But it was the emperor's treatment of the Slavic tribes in the Balkans that revealed the combination of strategic insight and brutal pragmatism that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than simply defending existing frontier positions, Justinian II launched offensive campaigns designed to resettle entire populations according to imperial demographic plans. Slavic communities were forcibly relocated from their traditional territories and transported to Anatolia, where they were expected to serve as farmer soldiers defending Byzantine heartland against Arab incursions. These resettlement policies were implemented with systematic violence that exceeded even Byzantine standards for frontier brutality. Entire villages were burned, livestock was slaughtered, and populations were marched hundreds of miles under guard, while imperial officials calculated optimal distribution patterns for maximum military effectiveness. Families were deliberately separated during the relocations, with children often sent to different provinces from their parents to prevent organized resistance and ensure complete cultural assimilation within a single generation. The emperor's fiscal policies, meanwhile, were generating increasing resistance among the traditional Byzantine elite, who formed the backbone of imperial administration and military command. Tax assessments reached confiscatory levels that threatened the economic foundations of aristocratic families that had supported imperial government for centuries. When wealthy landowners attempted to negotiate reduced obligations or traditional exemptions, Justinian's collectors responded with property confiscations and criminal prosecutions that transformed taxation disputes into treason cases. The breaking point came in 695 CE, when a coalition of senators, military commanders, and church officials concluded that the emperor's policies threatened the survival of Byzantine civilization itself. The conspiracy was led by Leontios, a general who had commanded frontier forces and understood both the military situation and the political impossibility of continuing Justinian's approach to governance. The coup was swift and decisive, with Praetorian guards seizing the imperial palace while the emperor was conducting routine administrative business. The punishment that the conspirators inflicted on the deposed emperor was calculated to ensure his permanent exclusion from power, while stopping short of martyrdom that might inspire future restoration attempts. Following ancient Byzantine precedent, they ordered Justinian's nose slit and his tongue partially severed, disfigurements that would prevent him from ever again appearing in public with imperial dignity, while leaving him alive to serve as a warning to potential tyrants. The rhinectomy was performed with deliberate care to maximize both physical damage and psychological humiliation. Imperial physicians used specialized instruments to ensure that the nasal cartilage was completely severed while leaving enough tissue to prevent fatal bleeding. The resulting wound was treated with hot irons to prevent healing in ways that might restore normal appearance, creating permanent disfigurement that would immediately identify the former emperor and eliminate any possibility of anonymous survival. Justinian was then exiled to Cherson in the Crimea, a remote frontier outpost where he could be monitored by imperial agents while remaining sufficiently distant from Constantinople to prevent him from organizing resistance movements. The exile was intended to be permanent, with the understanding that the former emperor would spend his remaining years as a powerless reminder of the consequences of tyrannical overreach and administrative incompetence. But exile proved to be education rather than defeat for the mutilated former emperor, who spent his years in Cherson studying the political dynamics of frontier society and building relationships with barbarian tribes that Byzantine administration had failed to control or effectively utilize. His disfigurement, rather than inspiring horror or contempt, actually enhanced his reputation among peoples who valued battle scars and viewed facial wounds as evidence of courage and determination. The Khazars, in particular, treated him as a valuable ally, whose inside knowledge of Byzantine military capabilities made him a potentially useful partner in future campaigns. The former emperor's marriage to the sister of the Khazar Khan represented both personal rehabilitation and political strategy, demonstrating that his imperial ambitions had survived physical mutilation and territorial exile. The union provided him with military support from Khazar warriors while establishing diplomatic relationships that could be activated when opportunities for restoration arose. More importantly, it gave Justinian access to the financial resources and logistical capabilities necessary for mounting a serious challenge to imperial authority in Constantinople. By 705 CE, political conditions in the Byzantine capital had deteriorated sufficiently to make restoration attempts feasible. The emperors who had replaced Justinian, first Leontios, Then Tiberius III had failed to solve the military and economic problems that had originally justified the coup against his reign. Arab pressure continued along the eastern frontiers. Tax collection remained inadequate for military needs, and popular discontent had reached levels that made governmental change seem inevitable, regardless of its specific direction. Justinian's return was orchestrated with careful attention to theatrical impact and psychological warfare that exploited his enemies' assumptions about the impossibility of restoration after mutilation and exile. He arrived at Constantinople wearing a golden prosthetic nose that proclaimed his imperial dignity while simultaneously calling attention to the injustices he had suffered at the hands of usurpers. The artificial nose was crafted by skilled artisans to approximate normal appearance from a distance, while remaining obviously artificial upon closer inspection, creating a visual symbol that combined imperial authority with victimization in ways that appealed to popular imagination. The military force that accompanied his return was deliberately diverse, including Byzantine troops who had remained loyal during his exile, Khazar warriors whose exotic appearance emphasized his foreign alliances, and Bulgarian auxiliaries whose presence demonstrated his ability to unite former enemies against current rulers. This coalition represented a new model of imperial power that transcended traditional ethnic and religious boundaries while maintaining essential Byzantine administrative and military structures. His recapture of Constantinople was accomplished through a combination of military pressure and internal conspiracy that demonstrated both strategic planning and ruthless execution. Supporters within the city opened gates during coordinated attacks that overcame resistance before organized defense could be mounted. The speed of the restoration surprised even Justinian's allies and left his enemies with no opportunity to negotiate surrenders or arrange orderly transitions that might have preserved their lives. The revenge that followed was systematic and comprehensive, targeting not merely the leaders of the previous coup, but entire categories of people who had supported or benefited from his original deposition. Leontios and Tiberius III were publicly executed in the Hippodrome, their deaths choreographed as entertainments that combined justice with spectacle, in ways designed to demonstrate the restored emperor's absolute power and divine favor. But Justinian's vengeance extended far beyond the punishment of actual conspirators to include anyone who had accepted positions or benefits during his exile. Bureaucrats who had continued serving imperial administration under different emperors found themselves charged with treason for failing to maintain loyalty during his absence. Merchants who had prospered during the interregnum faced property confiscations justified as recovery of wealth that rightfully belonged to the legitimate emperor. The financial policies that Justinian implemented during his restoration were even more extractive than those of his original reign, reflecting both his need to reward supporters and his determination to punish populations that had failed to resist his deposition. Tax levels reached unprecedented heights, while assessment methods became increasingly arbitrary, with collectors empowered to seize property based on accusations of disloyalty rather than documented fiscal obligations. Most controversially, the restored emperor launched massive population transfers that exceeded even his earlier resettlement policies in scope and brutality. Entire communities suspected of supporting his enemies were relocated to distant provinces, while vacant territories were repopulated with colonists whose loyalty had been demonstrated through active participation in his restoration. These demographic engineering projects disrupted traditional social and economic relationships throughout the empire, while creating administrative chaos that weakened defensive capabilities precisely when Arab military pressure was increasing. The psychological impact of Justinian's restoration was perhaps more significant than its immediate political consequences. The successful return of a mutilated and exiled emperor challenged fundamental assumptions about imperial legitimacy and the permanence of political change. If rhinectomy and exile could not permanently exclude a ruler from power, then what punishments could ensure dynastic stability? The precedent suggested that no victory over imperial authority could be considered final, creating paranoia among governing elites who realized that their own positions might never be truly secure. The emperor's final downfall in 711 CE came not through organized conspiracy, but through spontaneous military revolt during a campaign against Arab forces in Anatolia. His troops, exhausted by constant warfare and alienated by his treatment of civilian populations, simply refused to continue fighting under his command. The revolt was leaderless and unplanned, representing popular revulsion rather than aristocratic ambition, making it impossible for Justinian to counter through the political maneuvers and violent repressions that had previously maintained his authority. His death was appropriately theatrical and symbolically rich, coming when soldiers surrounded his tent and struck him down while he attempted to flee toward Khazar territories, where he had found refuge during his earlier exile. The emperor, who had survived mutilation, exile, and restoration, ultimately succumbed to the simple exhaustion of his subjects' willingness to tolerate his rule, dying not as a martyr or victim, but as a burden that his empire could no longer bear. The head that had worn both imperial diadems and golden prosthetic noses was severed and displayed in Constantinople as proof that the nightmare of restoration and revenge had finally ended. But the precedent that Justinian II had established that imperial power could survive physical mutilation, territorial exile, and apparent political death would haunt Byzantine politics for generations, inspiring pretenders and terrifying emperors who understood that absolute power provided no guarantee of permanent security. Yang of Sui Grand Canal Carcasses. Yang Guang ascended to the Dragon Throne in 604 CE as the second emperor of China's Sui dynasty, inheriting an empire recently unified after centuries of division, but burdened with expectations that would have challenged even the most capable ruler in Chinese history. The 35-year-old emperor possessed genuine administrative talents and visionary ambitions that might have secured his dynasty's future under different circumstances, but his reign would instead become synonymous with megalomaniacal construction projects that consumed millions of lives, while producing engineering marvels that outlasted the dynasty that built them. The new emperor, known to history as Yang Di, literally, Yang the Tyrant, had spent his youth governing southern provinces, where he demonstrated competent administration and genuine concern for public welfare that earned him popular support and bureaucratic respect. His policies promoted agricultural development, reduced tax burdens on peasant farmers, and improved local infrastructure through practical projects that served immediate community needs rather than imperial grandeur. These experiences convinced him that effective governance required active imperial involvement in economic development and territorial integration, rather than the passive ceremonial role that had characterized many of his predecessors. But Yang Di's conception of imperial responsibility was shaped by geographic and historical circumstances that made modest reform inadequate for the challenges facing the newly unified empire. The Sui-controlled territories stretching from Korea to Vietnam, encompassing dozens of distinct ethnic groups, multiple major river systems, and economic regions that had operated independently for centuries. Traditional Chinese governance relied on cultural assimilation and bureaucratic standardization, but Yang Di understood that effective integration required physical infrastructure that could move people, goods, and information across continental distances with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The Grand Canal project that would define his reign and destroy his dynasty emerged from this strategic analysis, combined with personal ambitions that exceeded all reasonable bounds of practical necessity. The emperor envisioned a navigable waterway connecting the Yangtze River basin with the Yellow River and ultimately extending to the northern capitals, creating an inland transportation network that would bind the empire together while demonstrating Chinese engineering capabilities to tributary states and potential enemies. The canal's proposed route covered over 100 miles of territory that included mountains, swamps, and multiple river systems that had never been successfully connected by human engineering. Previous rulers had constructed shorter canals for local irrigation and transportation, but Yang Di's project required tunneling through hills, building massive locks to manage elevation changes, and redirecting entire rivers to create a continuous waterway suitable for large-scale shipping. The technical challenges were staggering, but the emperor's vision extended beyond mere engineering achievement to encompass political and economic transformation of Chinese civilization itself. Construction began in 605 CE, with the mobilization of over 1 million workers drawn from across the empire through conscription quotas that fell most heavily on peasant farmers during crucial planting and harvest seasons. These laborers were organized into work gangs supervised by imperial engineers and guarded by military units responsible for maintaining discipline and preventing desertion. The working conditions were deliberately harsh, reflecting Yang Di's belief that monumental achievements required extreme sacrifice and that workers who survived the ordeal would be transformed into loyal subjects, proud of their contribution to imperial greatness. The human cost of canal construction exceeded even contemporary Chinese standards for corvée labor exploitation and mass mobilization projects. Workers were provided with minimal food rations, calculated to maintain working capacity rather than health or comfort, creating chronic malnutrition that made them susceptible to diseases that spread rapidly through crowded work camps. Medical care was essentially non-existent, with sick or injured laborers typically abandoned at construction sites, while their work quotas were reassigned to healthier replacements drawn from the constant stream of new conscripts. The death toll mounted with systematic regularity that imperial record-keepers documented with bureaucratic precision, tracking mortality rates by worksite, season, and construction phase. Conservative estimates suggest that over 3.3 million people died during the canal's construction, with bodies typically buried in mass graves along the route, or simply incorporated into earthwork foundations, where decomposition would contribute to soil stability. The canal itself became a linear cemetery stretching across northern China, its towpaths and lock systems built quite literally on the bones of the workers who had died creating them. Yang Di's personal involvement in the project extended beyond administrative oversight to include elaborate inspection tours that demonstrated both his commitment to the work and his complete disconnection from its human costs. The emperor traveled along completed sections in purpose-built dragon boats that featured silk canopies, jade fittings, and crews of musicians who provided constant entertainment during his surveys of construction progress. These floating palaces were accompanied by fleets of supply vessels carrying exotic foods, wines, and luxury goods that provided imperial comfort, while workers labored in conditions of deliberate deprivation. The contrast between imperial luxury and worker suffering was most visible during the emperor's ceremonial openings of completed canal sections, elaborate festivals that combined engineering celebration with religious ceremony and political theater. Yang Di would arrive in his dragon boat, wearing ceremonial robes worth more than entire villages' annual tax obligations, while crowds of workers were assembled to demonstrate their gratitude for the opportunity to participate in such magnificent imperial achievements. The workers, typically malnourished and exhausted from months of brutal labor, were expected to cheer enthusiastically, while imperial musicians performed compositions celebrating the canal's completion. Meanwhile, the emperor's military ambitions were consuming resources and manpower that the empire could not spare while the canal construction was draining available labor and financial reserves. Yang Di launched 3 successive invasions of Korea between 598 and 614 CE, campaigns designed to extend Chinese influence into the Korean peninsula while demonstrating imperial military capabilities to potential challengers throughout East Asia. These expeditions required massive armies, equipped with siege equipment, and supplied through logistics networks that competed directly with canal construction for available resources. The Korean campaigns were disasters that combined strategic miscalculation with tactical incompetence and logistical collapse that cost hundreds of thousands of Chinese lives, while achieving no meaningful political or territorial gains. The first invasion force of over 300 men was destroyed by Korean defenders, and bitter winter weather that the Chinese commanders had failed to anticipate or prepare for adequately. Entire divisions froze to death during river crossings that became death traps when early winter storms caught them without adequate clothing or shelter. The second and third Korean expeditions repeated these failures on even larger scales, with Zhengde apparently convinced that previous defeats resulted from insufficient commitment rather than fundamental strategic errors. He personally led the final invasion, traveling to the front in the same luxurious style that characterized his canal inspection tours, while his armies suffered from supply shortages and leadership failures that made military disaster inevitable from the campaign's beginning. The emperor's presence at the front provided him with direct exposure to military realities that his court life had insulated him from. But rather than inspiring greater realism about imperial capabilities, the experience seemed to convince him that personal imperial involvement could overcome any obstacle through sheer force of divine will. He issued increasingly grandiose orders for tactical maneuvers that ignored terrain, weather, and enemy capabilities, while demanding that his generals achieve impossible objectives through determination and loyalty alone. The retreat from Korea became a horror march that rivaled the canal construction in its systematic destruction of human life. Surviving Chinese forces attempted to withdraw across frozen rivers and through mountain passes, while harassed by Korean armies and devastated by weather conditions that killed more soldiers than enemy action. Zhengde returned to China ahead of his armies, traveling in heated carriages and staying in prepared shelters, while his men died by thousands during the winter retreat. The domestic consequences of these military failures, combined with canal construction costs, to create economic crisis that threatened the dynasty's survival and social stability throughout the empire. Tax collection reached confiscatory levels that forced peasant farmers to sell children and abandon farms to meet imperial revenue demands. Agricultural production declined as rural labor was diverted to construction projects and military service, creating food shortages that led to famine conditions in multiple provinces. Popular rebellions began erupting across the empire as early as 611 CE. Initially, small-scale uprisings led by local officials or displaced farmers, but gradually coalescing into larger movements that challenged imperial authority throughout entire regions. Zhengde's response to these revolts was characteristically excessive, dispatching military units to suppress dissent through systematic massacres that eliminated entire communities suspected of supporting rebel activities. The emperor's final years were spent in a traveling court that moved constantly between palaces and pleasure gardens while avoiding the dangerous realities of imperial collapse and popular revolution. His entourage included thousands of courtiers, servants, and entertainers who provided elaborate distractions from the mounting evidence of dynastic failure. The court's daily routine centered on elaborate meals, theatrical performances, and ceremonial hunts that maintained the fiction of imperial grandeur, while the empire disintegrated around them. Zhengde's assassination in 618 CE at the Jiangdu Palace was carried out by his own guards. Soldiers who had concluded that the emperor's continued survival threatened their own chances of finding new employment under whatever dynasty emerged from the chaos of Sui collapse. The killing was swift and efficient, accomplished during the emperor's evening bath when he was isolated from potential supporters and unable to call for help. The guards who killed Zhengde reportedly divided his personal jewelry and clothing among themselves before fleeing the palace, treating the former Son of Heaven's possessions as common plunder rather than sacred imperial regalia. His body was left floating in the bathwater while his killers looted the palace treasury and prepared to seek employment with rebel leaders who offered better prospects for survival and advancement than continued service to a dynasty that had destroyed itself through megalomaniacal excess. The Grand Canal survived its creator's death and dynastic collapse, remaining in use for over a millennium as a crucial transportation artery that justified Zhengde's vision, even as it testified to the human cost of achieving that vision through tyrannical methods. the waterway became both monument and memorial, commemorating Chinese engineering capabilities while serving as a permanent reminder that even the most magnificent imperial achievements could be purchased at prices that exceeded any reasonable calculation of benefit and cost. ZHENGDE, Emperor, tiger hunting in the human zoo. ZHOU ascended the dragon throne in 1505 CE at the tender age of 14, becoming the 10th emperor of China's Ming dynasty and inheriting an empire at the zenith of its territorial extent and cultural flowering. The boy emperor, known by his reign title ZHENGDE, meaning right virtue, possessed the quick intelligence and restless energy that characterized the best of his imperial lineage. But these qualities would manifest themselves in ways that transformed the Forbidden City into a vast playground and the Chinese Empire into an exotic entertainment complex designed for imperial amusement. The young emperor's education had been carefully managed by Confucian scholars who emphasized classical learning, moral cultivation, and the ceremonial responsibilities of imperial rule. But ZHENGDE displayed little interest in the philosophical subtleties and administrative minutiae that had occupied his more scholarly predecessors. Instead, he was fascinated by military affairs, exotic technologies, and the constant stream of foreign visitors who brought tribute to the Chinese court from kingdoms throughout Asia and beyond. His tutors found themselves competing for attention with Jesuit missionaries, Islamic astronomers, and Mongol princes, whose tales of distant lands and strange customs captivated the imperial imagination. The emperor's transformation from dutiful student into theatrical performer began during his late teens, when he discovered that imperial authority could be exercised through elaborate role-playing games that blurred the boundaries between reality and fantasy. ZHENGDE began adopting alternate identities during court ceremonies, appearing before ministers and foreign ambassadors, while claiming to be various fictional characters of his own invention. His favorite persona was General ZHOU, a military commander supposedly descended from ancient Chinese heroes who possessed supernatural abilities and commanded invisible armies. These masquerades were not brief theatrical diversions, but sustained performances that could last for weeks or months, during which the emperor would remain completely in character while conducting official business and making policy decisions. Court officials found themselves required to participate in elaborate charades, where they addressed their emperor as General ZHOU and pretended to receive military orders from a teenage fantasy character, rather than administrative instructions from their legitimate ruler. The psychological strain on the bureaucracy was immense, as seasoned administrators struggled to maintain governmental functions while humoring their emperor's increasingly elaborate delusions. The Forbidden City itself was gradually transformed into a stage set designed to support these imperial performances. Traditional throne rooms were redecorated to resemble military command posts, complete with maps, weapons displays, and captured enemy banners from various frontier campaigns. The emperor's private quarters were converted into barrack-style accommodations, where he lived like a soldier rather than an emperor, sleeping on camp beds and eating military rations while surrounded by the luxury and ceremony of imperial court life. More dramatically, ZHENGDE began constructing what he called the Leopard Quarter within the palace complex, an elaborate menagerie and entertainment district where he could pursue his growing obsession with exotic animals and foreign cultures without leaving the imperial grounds. The facility included artificial landscapes representing various tributary kingdoms, complete with native plants, architectural reproductions, and live animals imported from across the known world. The emperor would spend days exploring these manufactured environments while pretending to campaign in distant territories or negotiate with foreign rulers. The animal collection that formed the centerpiece of the Leopard Quarter represented the most extensive private zoo in Chinese history, featuring creatures acquired through tribute payments, diplomatic exchanges, and specially organized hunting expeditions to the empire's most remote provinces. Persian lions lounged in artificial caves designed to resemble their natural habitat, while African giraffes gifts from Islamic kingdoms, browsed from specially constructed feeding platforms that allowed visitors to observe their unprecedented height and graceful movements. But the emperor's particular fascination was with predatory cats, especially tigers and leopards, whose beauty and danger seemed to embody the qualities he wished to cultivate in his own imperial persona. He maintained dozens of these animals in elaborate compounds that allowed them to roam freely while providing safe viewing areas for human observers. The emperor would spend hours watching the cats hunt specially introduced prey animals, studying their techniques with the intensity of a military tactician analyzing enemy strategies. The logical progression of this interest led to ZHENGDE's decision to hunt tigers himself, initially within the controlled environment of the palace grounds, but eventually in expeditions to the wild forests and mountains, where these creatures lived in their natural habitat. These hunts were elaborate affairs requiring hundreds of participants, including professional hunters, military guards, court physicians, and servants responsible for transporting the imperial camping equipment and luxury supplies necessary for maintaining imperial comfort during outdoor adventures. The emperor's hunting technique involved neither the patient stalking preferred by experienced hunters, nor the organized drives used by professional tiger killers. Instead, ZHENGDE preferred direct confrontation that maximized both dramatic spectacle and personal danger, approaching tigers on foot, while armed only with spears or swords, in single combat that resembled gladiatorial contests more than conventional hunting. These encounters were choreographed for maximum theatrical impact, with the emperor's supporters positioned to observe and record his heroic achievements while remaining close enough to intervene if the imperial tiger hunter found himself overmatched. The predictable result was a series of increasingly dangerous incidents that culminated in the emperor's near-death experience during a hunt in the western hills outside Beijing. A particularly large tiger, apparently unimpressed by imperial dignity and hunting prowess, managed to claw through the emperor's protective clothing and inflict wounds that became infected despite the immediate attention of court physicians. ZHENGDE spent weeks recovering from these injuries, during which he developed the distinctive scars that he would proudly display for the remainder of his reign as proof of his courage and divine protection. Rather than deterring future hunting expeditions, this near-fatal encounter seemed to convince the emperor that he possessed supernatural abilities that allowed him to survive dangers that would kill ordinary mortals. He began planning even more ambitious hunting trips, including expeditions to Manchuria, where he hoped to encounter the legendary white tigers that Chinese mythology associated with imperial destiny and cosmic harmony. Meanwhile, the emperor's interest in foreign cultures was manifesting itself through the creation of human exhibitions that paralleled his animal collections, but involved actual people rather than exotic beasts. Tributary kingdoms and diplomatic missions were encouraged to send not merely gifts and formal ambassadors, but entire communities of craftsmen, performers, and cultural specialists who could demonstrate their native customs while residing permanently in the Forbidden City's expanding international quarter. These human displays featured Mongol horsemen demonstrating traditional riding techniques, Tibetan monks performing religious ceremonies in specially constructed temples, Islamic scholars conducting astronomical observations using instruments imported from the Middle East, and Southeast Asian dancers presenting elaborate theatrical performances that combined religious ritual with artistic entertainment. The emperor moved among these cultural exhibits like a visitor to a museum, sampling different customs and traditions while maintaining the superior position of imperial patron and ultimate authority. The psychological impact of this arrangement on the foreign residents was complex and often traumatic. They were simultaneously honored guests and captive performers, provided with luxurious accommodations and generous stipends, while being expected to remain constantly available for imperial entertainment and cultural curiosity. Many found themselves trapped in the palace for years or decades, unable to return home but forbidden to integrate fully into Chinese society, creating a population of exotic prisoners whose gilded captivity served imperial amusement rather than diplomatic necessity. The emperor's romantic interests during this period reflected the same combination of cultural curiosity and imperial privilege that characterized his other pursuits. Rather than confining himself to the traditional imperial harem of Chinese concubines, ZHENGDE actively sought intimate relationships with women from various tributary kingdoms and foreign delegations. His lovers included Mongol princesses, Korean court ladies, Islamic scholars, and even the occasional European missionary's daughter who had accompanied Jesuit delegations to the Chinese court. These relationships were conducted with the same theatrical flair that characterized the emperor's other activities, featuring elaborate courtship rituals, borrowed from various cultural traditions, and romantic adventures that were staged as entertainment for court observers. The emperor would adopt the courtship customs of his current romantic interests' homeland, appearing as a Mongol warrior to pursue a steppe princess, or as an Islamic scholar to court a Central Asian beauty, creating cross-cultural romantic theater that scandalized traditional Chinese observers while fascinating participants and audiences alike. The administrative consequences of the emperor's theatrical lifestyle became increasingly serious as his reign progressed and the practical business of governing a continental empire was subordinated to entertainment and role-playing activities. Important policy decisions were delayed or forgotten, while the emperor pursued hunting expeditions or cultural performances. Military commanders awaiting orders found themselves required to participate in elaborate court masquerades before receiving permission to address pressing frontier security issues. The financial costs of maintaining the emperor's expanding entertainment complex consumed imperial revenues at rates that made traditional court luxury seem modest by comparison. The exotic animal collection required specialized foods, veterinary care, and climate-controlled housing that cost more annually than the salaries of entire government departments. The international cultural exhibits demanded constant subsidies for their foreign residents, while requiring regular updates and additions that kept diplomatic missions scrambling to provide new performers and cultural specialists. Most expensive of all were the emperor's hunting expeditions and military adventures, elaborate productions that combined genuine frontier campaigning with theatrical performances designed to showcase imperial courage and divine favor. These expeditions required massive logistical support, including portable palaces, mobile kitchens, traveling entertainment troops, and military escorts large enough to ensure imperial security while providing audiences for the emperor's heroic adventures. The emperor's death in 1521 CE was appropriately theatrical and symbolically rich, occurring when he fell from a pleasure boat during a drunken celebration following a successful fishing expedition. The 16 years of his reign had transformed the Ming imperial system from a model of bureaucratic efficiency into a vast entertainment industry designed to serve one man's insatiable appetite for novelty and excitement. But the institutional damage proved surprisingly limited. Once more, conventional rulers resumed traditional approaches to imperial governance. ZHENGDE left no heir, having spent more time collecting exotic lovers than producing imperial successors. But his death was received with relief rather than mourning by court officials who understood that the empire had narrowly avoided complete transformation into a permanent theatrical performance. The elaborate cultural exhibitions were gradually dismantled. The exotic animals were distributed to zoos and temples throughout the empire, and the Forbidden City was restored to its traditional function as the administrative center of Chinese government rather than an imperial amusement park. Yet the memory of the emperor who had turned statecraft into performance art lingered in Chinese political culture as both cautionary tale and nostalgic fantasy, a reminder that absolute power could transform even the most serious imperial responsibilities into opportunities for creative self-expression and personal gratification. The Ming dynasty would produce more conventional rulers, but none would match ZHENGDE's ability to blur the boundaries between reality and imagination, between imperial authority and theatrical performance, between governing an empire and entertaining oneself at the empire's expense. Jiajing Emperor, Elixir of Virgin's Blood. Zhu Hukong ascended the Dragon Throne in 1521 as the Jiajing Emperor, the 11th ruler of China's Ming dynasty, inheriting power at age 14 through an unexpected succession crisis that had eliminated more direct heirs. Unlike his predecessor, ZHENGDE, whose reign had been characterized by theatrical excess and military adventures, the new emperor initially appeared to embody the scholarly virtues and administrative competence that traditional Chinese governance required. His early policies demonstrated genuine concern for fiscal responsibility, legal reform, and the restoration of court dignity after the chaos of the previous reign. But within a decade of his accession, Jiajing had developed an obsession that would define the remainder of his 45-year reign and transform him into one of Chinese history's most bizarre and reclusive rulers. The emperor became convinced that Taoist alchemical practices could grant him physical immortality, extending his natural lifespan indefinitely while maintaining his youthful vigor and divine authority over the Chinese empire. This quest for eternal life would consume vast resources, terrorize palace servants, and ultimately isolate the emperor from the practical responsibilities of governance, while China faced internal rebellions and external threats that required immediate imperial attention. The transformation began around 1530, when the emperor encountered a group of Taoist priests who claimed to possess ancient secrets for achieving immortality through careful meditation, dietary regulation, and the consumption of specially prepared alchemical substances. These spiritual advisors, led by a charismatic figure named Shao Yuanjie, convinced Jiajing that previous emperors had failed to achieve their full potential because they had neglected the mystical dimensions of imperial power in favor of mundane administrative concerns. The Taoist masters introduced the emperor to a complex system of beliefs and practices that combined traditional Chinese medical theory with esoteric spiritual disciplines and pseudo-scientific experimentation. According to their teachings, the human body contained various forms of qi vital energy that could be purified and concentrated through proper techniques, ultimately allowing practitioners to transcend normal biological limitations and achieve union with cosmic forces that govern the universe. The practical application of these theories involved elaborate daily rituals that gradually consumed more and more of the emperor's time and attention. Jiajing began rising before dawn to perform breathing exercises and meditation practices in specially constructed chambers designed to maximize the flow of beneficial qi while excluding negative influences that might interfere with spiritual development. These sessions could last for hours, during which the emperor remained in isolation while court officials waited to conduct essential government business. More controversially, the Taoist practices required the consumption of various substances believed to possess life-extending properties, including mercury, lead, arsenic, and other toxic materials that were prepared according to secret recipes supposedly derived from ancient immortal masters. The emperor's daily diet included pills, powders, and elixirs that contained these dangerous chemicals in concentrations that would have killed ordinary people, but were supposedly rendered beneficial through proper spiritual preparation and divine imperial constitution. The most disturbing aspect of the alchemical program involved the use of human bodily fluids, particularly those obtained from young women whose purity was believed to contain concentrated life force that could be transferred to the emperor through careful processing and consumption. Palace physicians, working under direct imperial orders and strict secrecy requirements, developed procedures for collecting menstrual blood, urine, and other secretions from carefully selected palace maids who met specific criteria for age, health, and virginity. These unfortunate women, typically girls between the ages of 13 and 16, were housed in special quarters where their daily activities, diet, and even sleep patterns were regulated according to alchemical principles designed to maximize the potency of their bodily products. They were forbidden to communicate with other palace residents, prevented from learning about their ultimate fate, and subjected to constant medical monitoring that treated them as living laboratories rather than human beings. The collection procedures were conducted with clinical precision that masked their fundamental brutality and dehumanization. Young women were restrained while physicians extracted blood, collected urine, and performed other intimate procedures that violated every concept of human dignity while serving the emperor's quest for immortality. Many of the subjects died from infections, blood loss, or psychological trauma, but their deaths were recorded as natural causes rather than consequences of imperial experimentation. The emperor's consumption of these human-derived substances was ritualized according to Taoist ceremonial requirements that supposedly enhanced their beneficial properties while preventing negative side effects. JIAJING would consume his daily dose of processed menstrual blood while performing specific chants and visualizations designed to direct the life force toward his internal organs and spiritual centers. The ritual typically concluded with meditation practices intended to integrate the newly acquired qi with his existing imperial essence. Meanwhile, the emperor's withdrawal from public life was becoming increasingly complete as his alchemical practices demanded ever more time and secrecy. By the 1540s, JIAJING had essentially abandoned the traditional imperial routine of daily audiences, policy consultations, and ceremonial appearances that maintained the visible connection between ruler and subjects. Instead, he retreated to a specially constructed complex within the Forbidden City called the Palace of Spiritual Cultivation, where he could pursue immortality without interference from mundane governmental concerns. The Palace of Spiritual Cultivation was designed according to Taoist architectural principles that supposedly enhanced the flow of beneficial cosmic energies while excluding harmful influences that might interfere with the emperor's spiritual development. The buildings featured unusual orientations, specialized ventilation systems, and chambers decorated with symbolic representations of immortal masters and celestial beings who served as models for the emperor's transformation. The emperor's daily routine within this complex followed a rigid schedule that prioritized alchemical practices over all other considerations. He would wake at the optimal astrological moment, consume his morning dose of mercury pills and human blood elixir, perform several hours of meditation and breathing exercises, receive brief reports from his most trusted advisors, consume additional alchemical substances during precisely timed intervals throughout the day, and conclude with evening rituals designed to consolidate the day's spiritual progress. This schedule left virtually no time for the practical business of governing an empire that included over 100 million people and faced constant challenges ranging from Mongol raids on the northern frontier to Japanese piracy along the coast and peasant rebellions in multiple provinces. Important decisions were delayed for weeks or months, while the emperor pursued his immortality experiments, creating administrative chaos that threatened the stability of the entire imperial system. The emperor's few interactions with court officials during this period were characterized by paranoid suspicion and erratic behavior that reflected the toxic effects of his alchemical consumption combined with the psychological isolation of his spiritual retreat. JIAJING became convinced that various ministers and palace servants were conspiring to poison him or interfere with his quest for immortality, leading to periodic purges that eliminated experienced administrators and created constant fear throughout the imperial bureaucracy. The breaking point in this reign of alchemical terror came in October 1542, when a group of palace maids, driven to desperation by the constant threat of being selected for blood collection and other experimental procedures, attempted to assassinate the emperor while he slept. The conspiracy involved over a dozen young women who had been subjected to the palace's medical experimentation program and had concluded that killing their tormentor was their only hope for survival and escape. The assassination attempt was carefully planned and nearly successful, involving the use of silk cords to strangle the emperor while he was unconscious from his evening dose of alchemical substances. The conspirators managed to position the strangling cord around JIAJING's neck and had begun tightening it when one of their number lost her nerve and cried out, alerting palace guards who burst into the imperial bedchamber and prevented the murder from being completed. The emperor's survival was attributed by his Taoist advisors to divine protection resulting from his spiritual practices and consumption of life-extending substances, but the near-death experience seems to have intensified rather than moderated his paranoid obsessions and reclusive tendencies. The failed assassination was followed by massive purges that eliminated not only the actual conspirators, but also hundreds of palace servants who were suspected of potential disloyalty or sympathy for the imperial assassins. The young women who had participated in the conspiracy were subjected to particularly brutal executions designed to demonstrate the consequences of attacking imperial authority. They were slowly tortured to death over periods of days or weeks, with their suffering carefully prolonged to maximize both punishment and deterrent effect. Their families were also executed, and their names were ordered erased from all records to ensure that no memory of their resistance would inspire future conspiracies. Rather than recognizing the assassination attempt as evidence that his alchemical program was driving palace residents to desperate measures, JIAJING interpreted the incident as proof that he needed even greater isolation and more intensive spiritual practices to protect himself from enemies who obviously feared his approaching immortality. He withdrew even further from public life, spending his final decades in almost complete seclusion, while consuming ever more toxic substances and subjecting ever more palace maids to his experimental procedures. The emperor's physical deterioration during his later years was dramatic and obvious to the few court officials who were permitted to see him during rare audiences. The constant consumption of mercury, lead, and arsenic had created chronic poisoning symptoms, including tremors, memory loss, and visible deterioration of his teeth, hair, and skin. But JIAJING interpreted these symptoms as temporary side effects of the purification process that would ultimately result in physical transformation and immortal youth. His death in January 1567, at the age of 60, was officially attributed to natural causes, but court physicians privately understood that decades of toxic consumption had finally overwhelmed even his imperial constitution. The emperor's body was reportedly discovered in his meditation chamber, surrounded by alchemical apparatus and partially dissolved pills that had been his final attempt to achieve the immortality that had obsessed him for nearly 4 decades. The burial arrangements for JIAJING included the interment of thousands of alchemical texts, experimental apparatus, and containers of various substances that the emperor had believed would be necessary for continuing his immortality quest in the afterlife. His tomb became a pharmaceutical warehouse stocked with mercury, processed blood products, and exotic substances that represented the accumulated waste of China's most expensive and futile scientific experiment. The imperial succession that followed JIAJING's death required extensive efforts to restore normal governmental functions and repair the administrative damage caused by decades of imperial neglect and paranoid isolation. The new emperor inherited a bureaucracy depleted by constant purges, a treasury drained by alchemical experiments, and frontier regions that had been left vulnerable while the previous ruler pursued his personal quest for eternal life at the expense of his temporal responsibilities. King ZHOU of SHANG torture garden of DAJI. In the mists of China's earliest recorded history, where legend bleeds into archaeological fact and moral instruction merges with genuine historical memory, stands the figure of King ZHOU of Shang, or Di Xin. As he was known before, later dynasties transformed him into the archetypal tyrant, whose name became synonymous with decadent cruelty and cosmic disorder. The last ruler of China's first historically verified dynasty, ZHOU reigned during the 11th century BCE, from the great Bronze Age capital of Anyang, where recent excavations have revealed both magnificent cultural achievements and evidence of systematic human sacrifice that lends credibility to the darkest tales surrounding his legendary reign. The Shang dynasty that Zhou inherited represented the pinnacle of Bronze Age Chinese civilization, a realm that controlled vast territories along the Yellow River Valley and commanded tribute from dozens of vassal states stretching across northern China. The capital at Anyang was a marvel of urban planning and artistic achievement, featuring elaborate palaces decorated with bronze vessels of unparalleled craftsmanship, royal tombs filled with jade artifacts that demonstrated sophisticated mineral working techniques, and workshop complexes where skilled artisans produced luxury goods that were traded across East Asia. But Zhou's court was also heir to religious traditions that modern sensibilities find difficult to comprehend, practices involving human sacrifice, on scales that archaeological evidence suggests were routine rather than exceptional. Royal funerals required the burial of dozens or hundreds of servants, soldiers, and concubines who were expected to accompany their masters into the afterlife. Military victories were celebrated with the execution of captured enemies, whose deaths supposedly ensured divine favor for future campaigns. Even routine religious ceremonies involved the killing of human beings, whose blood was believed necessary for maintaining cosmic harmony and royal legitimacy. Into this world of institutionalized sacred violence came the woman known to history as DAJI, whose origins remain shrouded in the mythological elaborations that later dynasties wove around her memory. According to traditional accounts, she was either a concubine captured during Zhou's military campaigns against the Zhou tribe, or a fox spirit who had taken human form specifically to seduce and corrupt the Shang king as part of a divine plan to end his dynasty. Archaeological evidence cannot confirm either version, but the psychological patterns described in these stories, the gradual corruption of a competent ruler through sexual obsession and increasing isolation from practical governance, have parallels throughout Chinese imperial history that suggest underlying historical accuracy. What can be established from contemporary bronze inscriptions and oracle bone records is that Zhou's later years were marked by increasing military pressure from Western tribes, internal rebellions among vassal states, and natural disasters that traditional Chinese historiography interpreted as signs of lost cosmic approval. The king's responses to these challenges became increasingly erratic and violent, suggesting either psychological deterioration or desperate attempts to maintain authority through terror when conventional methods of rule had proven inadequate. The torture devices and execution methods that became associated with Zhou's reign were described in such vivid detail by later historians that they became part of Chinese cultural memory long after the Shang dynasty's collapse. The most notorious was the roasting pillar, or paolao, a bronze column that could be heated until it glowed red hot, then used to force condemned prisoners to embrace its surface while they burned to death. The device was reportedly installed in the royal palace, where Zhou and Daji could watch executions from comfortable vantage points while enjoying elaborate meals prepared by court chefs. The psychological appeal of this method lay in its combination of technological sophistication with primitive cruelty, demonstrating Shang bronze working capabilities while satisfying appetites for sadistic entertainment that transcended mere punishment or political control. Victims were forced to climb onto the heated pillar and maintain their grip while their flesh burned away, creating spectacles that could last for hours, while the royal couple observed their suffering with the detached interest of connoisseurs evaluating artistic performances. But the roasting pillar represented only one element in what later chroniclers described as a comprehensive system of creative torture that transformed the Shang palace into a theater of cruelty, where human suffering was refined into entertainment through systematic application of technological innovation and artistic imagination. Other devices allegedly included bronze cauldrons large enough to boil human beings alive, mechanical contraptions that could slowly crush victims while keeping them conscious, and various forms of mutilation equipment that could remove specific body parts in sequences designed to maximize pain while prolonging consciousness. The historical accuracy of these specific descriptions remains debatable, but archaeological evidence from Anyang includes bronze vessels, sacrificial pits, and human remains that demonstrate both the technical capabilities and the cultural willingness to engage in systematic human killing that would have made such innovations possible. More importantly, the detailed preservation of these accounts in later Chinese literature suggests that they served important cultural functions beyond mere sensationalism, providing moral instruction about the consequences of tyrannical rule while establishing narrative templates for understanding imperial corruption and dynastic decline. According to traditional accounts, Daji's influence over ZHOU extended beyond sexual attraction into theological innovation that corrupted Shang religious practices in ways that offended both gods and subjects. She supposedly convinced the king to abandon traditional sacrifice protocols in favor of more elaborate and cruel ceremonies that satisfied her personal taste for spectacular violence, while alienating the priest bureaucrats who conducted official religious functions and maintained relationships with vassal rulers throughout the kingdom. The most infamous of these innovations was the creation of what chroniclers called the Wine Lake and Meat Forest, an elaborate garden complex where trees were hung with strips of cooked meat while artificial lakes were filled with wine, creating an environment where courtiers could indulge in unlimited consumption while watching elaborate torture sessions designed specifically for their entertainment. The facility allegedly operated continuously, with shifts of musicians, dancers, and executioners providing around-the-clock programming that combined bacchanalian excess with systematic cruelty in ways that demonstrated both royal power and complete abandonment of traditional restraints on imperial behavior. The logistical requirements for maintaining such an operation would have been staggering, involving not only the constant procurement of wine and meat, but also the systematic production of human victims, whose torture could provide adequate entertainment for jaded courtiers who had presumably become accustomed to conventional forms of cruelty. The system required administrative structures that could coordinate food production, victim acquisition, torture scheduling, and waste disposal while maintaining the aesthetic standards appropriate for royal entertainment venues. The economic costs of these extravagances, combined with increasing military pressure from ZHOU Kingdom forces in the west to create fiscal crisis that undermined Shang military capabilities precisely when external threats required maximum governmental efficiency and resource mobilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that tribute payments from vassal states declined significantly during ZHOU's final years, while bronze production shifted from ceremonial vessels to military equipment in ways that indicate growing concern about defensive capabilities rather than confident expansion of cultural influence. The king's responses to these challenges revealed both the sophistication and the limitations of Shang governmental structures when subjected to the pressures of simultaneous external warfare and internal administrative chaos. Oracle bone divination records from this period show increasing frequency of questions about military tactics, harvest prospects, and royal health, suggesting that traditional religious consultation was being used to address practical problems that conventional bureaucratic methods could no longer handle effectively. But the divination results recorded on these oracle bones also reveal growing pessimism about royal prospects and divine approval, with repeated inquiries about ritual purification, sacrifice requirements, and methods for regaining lost cosmic favor. The king's relationship with traditional religious authorities appears to have deteriorated as his personal conduct became increasingly incompatible with established ritual protocols and moral expectations that legitimized Shang rule over vassal states and subject populations. The rebellion that finally ended Zhou's reign was led by King Wu of the Zhou people, a Western tribe that had gradually accumulated military strength while maintaining nominal tributary relationships with the Shang court. The decisive Battle of Muye in 1046 BCE saw Shang forces defeated not merely by superior ZHOU military capabilities, but by widespread defection among ZHOU's own troops, who reportedly turned their weapons against their king, rather than defending a ruler who had lost both divine approval and popular support. The traditional account of ZHOU's final hours describes him as retreating to his palace while ZHOU forces occupied the capital and began systematic destruction of Shang governmental structures. Rather than attempting escape or negotiated surrender, the last Shang king allegedly dressed himself in royal regalia, gathered his most precious possessions, and set fire to his palace complex while still inside, choosing death by immolation over the humiliation of capture and public execution. The psychological motivations behind this decision, if the traditional account contains historical accuracy, suggest both genuine royal pride and recognition that his reign had become so notorious that survival would have meant permanent disgrace rather than mere political defeat. By choosing suicide in royal costumes surrounded by palace treasures, ZHOU transformed his death into a final assertion of imperial dignity that denied his enemies the satisfaction of public humiliation, while creating a dramatic conclusion to his reign that subsequent historians could interpret according to their own moral and political purposes. The archaeological evidence from Anyang supports at least portions of this traditional narrative, with clear indicators of deliberate destruction and burning that occurred during the period when ZHOU forces would have occupied the city. Palace complexes show evidence of systematic fire damage, while royal tomb areas contain signs of hasty evacuation or abandonment that suggest the final Shang court's rapid collapse under military pressure. The transformation of ZHOU from historical ruler into legendary tyrant occurred over centuries of retelling by ZHOU dynasty historians who needed to justify their conquest of the Shang while establishing moral principles that would legitimize their own authority. The stories of torture gardens and fox spirit corruption served multiple functions. They explained why the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven. They provided cautionary examples about the dangers of imperial excess, and they established narrative templates for understanding tyranny that would influence Chinese political thought for millennia. Yet, beneath these moralizing elaborations, the figure of ZHOU represents something more troubling than simple cautionary tale, evidence that systematic cruelty and technological sophistication could coexist within the same civilization, that cultural achievement and moral corruption were not necessarily incompatible, and that the human capacity for elaborate sadism required only opportunity and authority to reach levels that transcended normal imagination. The bronze vessels and jade artifacts that survive from ZHOU's court testify to aesthetic refinement and technical mastery, while the oracle bones and sacrificial remains reveal casual acceptance of human suffering that challenges modern assumptions about the relationship between civilization and humanitarianism. Bokassa, cannibal coronation. Jean-Bedel Bokassa's transformation from French colonial paratrooper to self-proclaimed emperor of the Central African Empire represents perhaps the most grotesque example of post-colonial megalomania in modern African history, a reign of terror that combined Napoleon's imperial theatricality with practices that allegedly included systematic cannibalism, child murder, and financial corruption that bankrupted one of the world's poorest nations, while funding elaborate ceremonies designed to impress a world that watched in horrified fascination. Born in 1921 in Bobangui, a remote village in what was then French Equatorial Africa, Bokassa experienced childhood trauma that may have shaped his later psychological development when his father was murdered by French colonial administrators and his mother committed suicide shortly afterward, leaving him orphaned at age 6 in a society where traditional support structures had been disrupted by European colonization and economic exploitation. He was raised by missionaries who provided basic education while instilling French cultural values that would later manifest as obsessive identification with European imperial models and desperate hunger for international recognition and respect. Military service in the French colonial forces provided Bokassa with structure, purpose, and advancement opportunities that civilian life in colonial Africa could never have offered, allowing him to rise through the ranks during World War II and the Indochina conflicts, while developing leadership skills and political connections that would prove crucial when independence movements swept across French Africa in the 1960s. His service record was distinguished, earning decorations for valor and competence that demonstrated genuine military abilities alongside the charismatic leadership qualities that would later enable his political rise. When the Central African Republic achieved independence in 1960, Bokassa returned home as a decorated war veteran with French citizenship, military experience, and political ambitions that were initially channeled through conventional democratic processes under President David Daco's government. But the new nation's economic struggles, ethnic tensions, and administrative inexperience created opportunities for military intervention that Bokassa seized on New Year's Eve, 1965, leading a bloodless coup that installed him as president while promising efficiency, order, and development that civilian politicians had failed to deliver. The early years of Bokassa's rule showed genuine achievements in infrastructure development, educational expansion, and administrative reform that suggested his military background might provide the discipline and organization necessary for effective post-colonial governance. He built roads, schools, and hospitals while maintaining relatively cordial relationships with France and other international partners who viewed him as a stabilizing influence in a region prone to political chaos and economic collapse. But power's intoxicating effects gradually revealed personality traits that had been suppressed during his military career, including grandiose fantasies, violent temper, and obsessive need for recognition that would eventually transform him from competent military administrator into a figure of international ridicule and domestic terror. His fascination with Napoleon Bonaparte began as admiration for French military genius, but evolved into complete identification with imperial authority and ceremonial grandeur that bore no relationship to his nation's actual capabilities or needs. The decision to transform the Central African Republic into an empire with himself as emperor reflected both psychological megalomania and calculating political strategy designed to enhance his international standing while justifying increasingly autocratic domestic policies. By 1977, Bokassa had convinced himself that imperial status would force world leaders to treat him as an equal rather than dismissing him as just another African dictator, elevating his nation's prestige while providing personally satisfying opportunities for elaborate ceremonial display. The coronation ceremony that took place on December 4, 1977, consumed approximately 70 million, roughly one-third of the nation's annual budget, while showcasing Bokassa's fundamental misunderstanding of both imperial symbolism and his country's economic realities. The event was modeled explicitly on Napoleon's 1804 coronation, complete with imported French designers, specially commissioned regalia, and elaborate protocols that attempted to recreate European imperial majesty in one of Africa's poorest capitals. The centerpiece was a diamond-encrusted crown that cost 5 million and weighed several pounds, requiring special neck supports to prevent the emperor from collapsing under its weight during the lengthy ceremony. His throne was crafted from gilded bronze shaped like a giant eagle, while his coronation robes were woven with gold thread and decorated with ermine fur imported from Europe at enormous expense. The cathedral where the ceremony took place was air-conditioned specifically for the event, a luxury unknown to most of his subjects, who lacked access to electricity or running water. International attendance was sparse and grudging, with most foreign dignitaries sending low-level representatives who understood that their presence legitimized absurdity, but felt obligated to maintain diplomatic relationships with a regime that controlled significant uranium deposits and other strategic resources. The contrast between the ceremony's Baroque excess and the grinding poverty visible just outside the cathedral walls created images that symbolized everything wrong with post-colonial African leadership, while providing propaganda material for critics of foreign aid and international development assistance. But behind the comic opera facade of imperial pretension lay systematic brutality that made Bokassa's regime genuinely dangerous rather than merely ridiculous. His presidential guard was reorganized along imperial lines, with elaborate uniforms and ceremonial weapons, but their primary function was terrorizing political opposition and maintaining order through violence that exceeded even African standards for authoritarian governance. Prisons filled with political prisoners who were subjected to torture, starvation, and execution, while their families faced collective punishment designed to discourage resistance or criticism. The emperor's personal involvement in torture and execution was documented by numerous witnesses and survivors who described sessions where Bokassa personally beat prisoners with clubs, supervised their mutilation, and allegedly participated in cannibalistic consumption of their remains. These activities allegedly took place in specially constructed chambers beneath the imperial palace, soundproofed rooms equipped with restraints, torture devices, and refrigeration facilities that could preserve human flesh for later consumption by the emperor and his inner circle. The cannibalism allegations, while never conclusively proven in court, were supported by sufficient witness testimony and physical evidence to convince French intelligence services and international observers that Bokassa had indeed incorporated human flesh into his diet, viewing it as both a source of supernatural power and a demonstration of absolute dominion over his subjects. Refrigerated storage areas in the palace contained what appeared to be human body parts, while kitchen staff reported receiving instructions about preparing special meat that was served only to the emperor and select guests. The psychological motivations behind these practices seemed to combine traditional African beliefs about consuming enemies' strength with European fascination with cannibalism as the ultimate taboo, creating a uniquely horrible synthesis that satisfied both Bokassa's need for supernatural empowerment and his desire to shock European observers who had dismissed him as a primitive African leader unworthy of serious attention. By embracing the most extreme stereotypes about African savagery, he paradoxically asserted his power over European prejudices while demonstrating that he was capable of exceeding their worst expectations. Children proved particularly vulnerable to imperial violence, both as direct victims and as symbols of future opposition that needed to be eliminated before it could mature into actual threats to imperial authority. School massacres became routine responses to student protests against uniform requirements, curriculum changes, or administrative policies that reflected Bokassa's increasingly erratic governance and growing disconnection from his subjects' daily struggles and legitimate grievances. The most notorious of these incidents occurred in April 1979, when students at a Bangui secondary school protested against mandatory purchase of expensive uniforms manufactured by companies owned by the emperor's family. Members. The demonstration was peaceful and focused on specific economic grievances rather than broader political opposition. But Bokassa interpreted it as treasonous rebellion that required exemplary punishment to prevent future challenges to imperial authority. The emperor's response involved personal participation in mass murder that shocked even his own security forces and marked the beginning of international efforts to remove him from power. He arrived at the school with imperial guards and personally participated in beating students to death with clubs and other weapons, reportedly killing dozens of children while forcing survivors to watch as examples of what happened to subjects who challenged imperial decisions. Bodies were mutilated and displayed around the school grounds as warnings to other students, while surviving witnesses were threatened with similar treatment if they reported what they had seen to parents or outside authorities. The massacre was concealed from international observers for several months, but eventual revelation of the details prompted French officials to begin planning intervention that would remove Bokassa before his actions could further embarrass France's African policies. The emperor's relationship with France during this period was complex and increasingly strained, as French officials attempted to balance strategic interests in maintaining influence over Central African resources against growing embarrassment over their association with a regime that had become internationally notorious for its brutality and incompetence. Bokassa's frequent visits to France, during which he lavished expensive gifts on French officials while requesting military support and financial assistance, created uncomfortable situations where European leaders found themselves entertaining a figure who was simultaneously useful ally and moral monster. French intelligence services had detailed knowledge of Bokassa's crimes, including photographic evidence of torture chambers and witness testimony about cannibalism and child murder, but continued supporting his regime until the negative publicity became impossible to manage through conventional diplomatic channels. The calculation was coldly practical. Bokassa controlled uranium mines, diamond deposits, and strategic territory that France needed to maintain African influence, making his personal behavior secondary to geopolitical considerations. The breaking point came when French journalists obtained evidence of the school massacres and began publishing detailed accounts that made continued French support politically impossible in domestic contexts, where public opinion was increasingly opposed to African interventions that appeared to support dictatorial brutality. President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who had personal relationships with Bokassa and had accepted expensive gifts from him, faced growing criticism that threatened his own political survival. Operation Barracuda, launched on September 20, 1979, was a French military intervention disguised as support for internal opposition forces, led by former President David Dacko, who had been living in exile since Bokassa's original coup 14 years earlier. French paratroopers landed at Bangui Airport, while Bokassa was visiting Libya, establishing control over key government facilities and communication centers before imperial forces could organize effective resistance. The operation was completed within hours, demonstrating both French military efficiency and the underlying weakness of Bokassa's regime once external support was withdrawn. Imperial guards offered minimal resistance before abandoning their positions and melting into the civilian population, while government officials either fled the country or immediately pledged loyalty to the restored republic under Dacko's leadership. Bokassa himself learned of his overthrow while attending a meeting with Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, who reportedly informed him that his reign was over and that return to Central Africa would result in immediate arrest and trial for crimes against humanity. The former emperor was granted asylum in France, where he lived in relative comfort, while international human rights organizations documented his regime's atrocities and prepared legal cases that would eventually result in his conviction in absentia for murder, cannibalism, and crimes against humanity. The palace complex that French forces secured revealed physical evidence that supported the most horrific allegations against Bokassa's regime, including refrigerated storage areas containing human remains, torture chambers equipped with specialized restraints and mutilation devices, and documentation of systematic brutality that exceeded even pessimistic intelligence estimates. The discoveries confirmed that the cannibalism allegations were based on physical reality rather than mere propaganda, while revealing the institutional nature of violence that had characterized imperial administration. The Central African Empire's collapse left behind economic devastation that would plague the nation for decades, with infrastructure projects abandoned, educational systems disrupted, and government institutions corrupted beyond immediate repair. Bokassa's legacy was a cautionary tale about post-colonial leadership that combined the worst aspects of European imperial models with traditional African authoritarianism, creating hybrid forms of tyranny that satisfied neither indigenous values nor international standards of governance. ZHETIAN, Iron Lotus Throne. Wu Zhao's ascent from imperial concubine to China's only officially recognized female emperor represents the most audacious seizure of political power in Chinese history. A campaign that required the systematic elimination of rivals, the manipulation of religious doctrine, and the creation of administrative structures that could function under feminine authority in a civilization that had never imagined such a possibility. Her reign as Empress Wu Zetian from 690 to 705 CE combined genuine administrative competence with systematic brutality that made her simultaneously one of China's most effective rulers and its most feared imperial figure. Born around 624 CE into a wealthy merchant family during the early Tang dynasty, Wu Zhou entered the imperial palace as a 14-year-old concubine to Emperor Taizong, beginning her political education in an environment where survival required constant manipulation, alliance building, and careful observation of court dynamics that could shift without warning. The imperial harem was a world unto itself, containing hundreds of women whose access to power depended entirely on their ability to attract and maintain imperial attention while navigating complex hierarchies of jealousy, ambition, and strategic positioning. Wu's initial status was relatively modest. She was assigned the title of Talented Lady, a mid-level concubine rank that provided palace privileges while offering little hope of advancement to positions that could influence imperial policy or succession planning. But her intelligence, beauty, and ruthless pragmatism quickly distinguished her from other women who relied solely on physical attractiveness or family connections to advance their positions within the harem's competitive environment. The crucial opportunity came when Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE and his son Gaozong ascended the throne, creating the succession transition that Wu had been preparing for through years of careful relationship building and strategic positioning. Rather than accepting the traditional fate of former imperial concubines, which typically involved forced religious retirement or relegation to caretaking roles for the deceased emperor's memorial, Wu managed to establish herself as a favored consort of the new emperor, while systematically eliminating rivals who might challenge her influence. Her first major victim was Empress Wang, Gaozong's primary wife, whom Wu accused of murdering Wu's own infant daughter in a palace intrigue that combined genuine political calculation with theatrical manipulation designed to evoke imperial sympathy and rage. The accusation was almost certainly false. Wu herself had likely killed the child to create evidence against her rival, but it demonstrated her understanding that successful conspiracy required both careful planning and willingness to sacrifice anything, including her own children, to achieve political objectives. The fall of Empress Wang was orchestrated through a campaign that combined character assassination, manufactured evidence, and strategic alliance building, with court officials who recognized Wu's growing influence and chose to support her ascension rather than risk opposition to an obviously formidable political operator. Wu's methods included bribery, blackmail, and promises of future advancement that convinced key administrators and military commanders to abandon their loyalty to the established empress in favor of the ambitious concubine who clearly represented the future power structure. Once installed as empress herself in 655 CE, Wu began the systematic process of consolidating power that would eventually enable her to rule China in her own name, rather than merely exercising influence through her husband. This process required neutralizing potential rivals within the imperial family, establishing control over the administrative apparatus that actually governed the empire, and creating new institutions that could function under feminine leadership while maintaining the appearance of traditional Chinese governmental structures. The elimination of rivals began with Emperor Gaozong's sons from his previous marriage, young princes whose existence represented potential alternative sources of imperial legitimacy that could challenge Wu's position if her husband died or became incapacitated, rather than arranging obvious assassinations that might provoke reaction from their supporters. Wu orchestrated a series of apparent accidents, sudden illnesses, and judicial proceedings that removed these threats while maintaining plausible deniability about her involvement in their deaths. Her own sons by Gaozong were raised under her direct supervision and trained to accept maternal authority as natural and legitimate, rather than viewing it as temporary aberration that would end when they reached adulthood and could claim independent imperial authority. This psychological conditioning was crucial for Wu's long-term plans, as she needed heirs who would either support her continued rule or prove controllable if they eventually inherited nominal imperial status. The administrative revolution that Wu implemented during her years as empress involved the systematic placement of loyal officials in key positions throughout the imperial bureaucracy, creating networks of obligation and mutual dependence that ensured her commands would be implemented even when they contradicted traditional protocols or challenged established interests. She understood that effective power required control over information flow, resource allocation, and personnel decisions that shaped daily governmental operations. Her intelligence network became legendary for its reach and efficiency, utilizing everyone from palace servants to provincial governors as potential sources of information about political opposition, popular sentiment, and foreign threats that might challenge imperial stability. This system relied heavily on financial incentives, career advancement, opportunities, and fear of punishment to maintain loyalty among informants who understood that their survival often depended on providing accurate intelligence about activities that might interest the empress. But Wu's most innovative creation was the secret police force, known as the cruel officials, administrators whose primary function was investigating and punishing suspected disloyalty among government officials, aristocratic families, and anyone else who might pose challenges to imperial authority. These officials operated outside normal legal constraints, with authority to arrest, torture, and execute suspects based on accusations rather than formal evidence, creating an atmosphere of pervasive fear that discouraged opposition while demonstrating the empress's absolute power over life and death. The torture methods employed by these officials were deliberately designed to maximize psychological impact rather than merely extracting confessions or eliminating specific threats. Victims were subjected to carefully planned suffering that served as examples to potential opponents, while satisfying Wu's apparent personal taste for elaborate cruelty that combined traditional Chinese punishments with innovations that reflected her understanding of how fear could be used as a governmental tool. The most notorious of these methods was the human pig punishment, which involved the systematic removal of a victim's limbs, followed by destruction of their eyes, ears, and tongue, leaving them as helpless torsos that could be kept alive for extended periods as living demonstrations of what happened to people who opposed imperial authority. The empress reportedly maintained several such victims in palace chambers, where they could be displayed to visitors who needed reminders about the consequences of political opposition. Other punishments included drowning in vats of vinegar, slow roasting over charcoal fires, and various forms of mutilation that were designed to create maximum suffering while ensuring that victims remained conscious long enough to serve as effective examples to observers. These executions were often conducted in public spaces where their educational value could be maximized, turning imperial justice into theatrical performances that combined entertainment with political instruction. The religious innovations that Wu introduced to legitimize feminine imperial authority represented perhaps her most sophisticated political achievement, involving the manipulation of Buddhist doctrine to create theological justifications for unprecedented constitutional arrangements that violated fundamental Chinese assumptions about gender roles and cosmic hierarchy. Traditional Confucian theory held that feminine rule disrupted natural order and invited divine displeasure, making Wu's position inherently illegitimate according to established philosophical frameworks. Her solution involved promoting alternative Buddhist teachings that proclaimed the coming of Maitreya Buddha, the future savior who would establish perfect governance on earth, while simultaneously circulating texts that identified Wu herself as this prophesied figure reborn in feminine form to demonstrate divine compassion and wisdom. These texts were produced by sympathetic monks who received substantial financial support and political protection in exchange for their theological creativity and willingness to challenge traditional religious authorities. The propaganda campaign that promoted these ideas was remarkably sophisticated, utilizing everything from public ceremonies to architectural projects that reinforced Wu's claims to divine authority, while providing tangible benefits to supporters who participated in establishing the new religious orthodoxy. Temples were built, statues were erected, and festivals were established that celebrated the empress as religious figure rather than merely political ruler, creating cultural infrastructure that supported her legitimacy claims. By 690 CE, Wu felt confident enough to take the ultimate step of deposing her own son, Emperor Zhongzong, and declaring herself emperor of a new Zhou dynasty named after the ancient royal house that had overthrown the Shang over a millennium earlier. This unprecedented action required careful timing and extensive preparation, involving the coordination of military units, administrative changes, and propaganda campaigns that could present the transition as natural evolution rather than revolutionary disruption. Her 15-year reign as emperor demonstrated both the advantages and limitations of absolute feminine authority in traditional Chinese contexts. On the positive side, Wu proved to be an extremely competent administrator who maintained imperial territorial integrity, promoted economic development, and established governmental institutions that functioned efficiently under her direct supervision. She patronized arts and learning, built impressive architectural projects, and maintained diplomatic relationships with foreign powers that enhanced China's international prestige. But the psychological costs of maintaining power through systematic terror created long-term problems that would undermine the dynasty's stability after her death, as the networks of fear and mutual suspicion that had enabled her rule also prevented the development of stable succession mechanisms that could ensure smooth transitions to future leadership. The administrative apparatus that she created was too dependent on her personal authority and too compromised by its association with her brutal methods to function effectively under different leadership styles. The end of Wu's reign came not through violent overthrow, but through the gradual recognition that her advanced age and declining health made continued rule impossible. Combined with pressure from court officials who understood that restoration of traditional masculine imperial authority was necessary for long-term dynastic survival. In 705 CE, at age 81, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her son, who immediately began the process of dismantling her innovations while preserving those aspects of her governmental system that had proven administratively effective. Her death later that year was followed by systematic efforts to erase evidence of feminine imperial rule while preserving the governmental achievements that had made her reign successful despite its constitutional irregularities. The monument that she had prepared for herself reflected this ambiguity. The famous wordless stele at her tomb bears no inscription, leaving future generations to interpret her legacy according to their own political needs and moral standards, rather than accepting any official version of her historical significance. Ivan, the terrible Oprichnina and opera of screams. Ivan Vasilievich ascended to the throne of Muscovy in 1547 as Ivan IV, the first Russian ruler to formally adopt the title of Tsar and claim inheritance from the Byzantine Empire's imperial legacy. But his reign would be remembered not for constitutional innovations or territorial expansion, but for the systematic creation of state terror apparatus that transformed Russia into a laboratory for exploring the outer limits of absolute power and institutional cruelty. The young man who began his rule with genuine reforms and administrative competence would evolve into Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, whose name became synonymous with paranoid tyranny and violence that exceeded even Russian standards for autocratic brutality. Born in 1530, Ivan experienced childhood trauma that shaped his psychological development in ways that would later manifest as pathological suspicion and explosive violence directed against anyone who might challenge his authority or independence. His father, Vasily III, died when Ivan was 3 years old, leaving him nominally in charge of a vast realm while real power was exercised by competing boyar factions whose struggles for influence involved kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder that turned the royal court into a battlefield where survival required constant vigilance and strategic thinking. The Regency period exposed young Ivan to political dynamics that combined elaborate court ceremony with underlying violence, teaching him that authority was always contested, that loyalty was temporary and conditional, and that effective rule required the systematic elimination of potential threats before they could organize into actual challenges. He witnessed the imprisonment and execution of relatives, the sudden disappearance of court officials who had fallen from favor, and the routine use of torture and mutilation as governmental tools that distinguished between friend and enemy. These experiences created psychological patterns that would define Ivan's entire approach to imperial authority: profound distrust of subordinates, obsessive attention to potential conspiracies, and conviction that survival required preemptive violence against anyone who might eventually pose threats to his power. By the time he assumed personal rule at age 17, Ivan had concluded that effective governance required the systematic terrorization of the governing class itself, making fear rather than loyalty the foundation of political obedience. His early reforms demonstrated genuine administrative talent and understanding of the practical requirements for effective governance of Russia's vast territories and diverse populations. Ivan convened the First Zemsky Sobor, Assembly of the Land, established new legal codes that standardized justice across his domains, and reorganized military structures that improved frontier defense while creating career advancement opportunities for service nobility who owed their positions to imperial favor rather than inherited privilege. These reforms were motivated by strategic vision that recognized Russia's need for institutional modernization to compete with emerging European powers while maintaining cultural and religious independence that distinguished Orthodox civilization from Catholic and Protestant alternatives developing in Western Europe. Ivan understood that effective autocracy required efficient administration, legal predictability, and military competence that could only be achieved through systematic governmental reform rather than relying solely on traditional authority structures. But the psychological pressures of absolute rule, combined with Ivan's traumatic childhood experiences and growing paranoia about boyar conspiracies, gradually transformed him from reforming administrator into terroristic tyrant, whose policies were designed more to satisfy personal psychological needs than to achieve practical governmental objectives. The transition became obvious during the 1560s, when a series of military setbacks, personal tragedies, and perceived betrayals convinced Ivan that his survival required the complete reconstruction of Russian political society according to principles of systematic fear and institutional violence. The catalyst for this transformation was the death of his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560, which Ivan attributed to poisoning by boyar conspirators who sought to eliminate moderating influences on his behavior while creating opportunities to manipulate imperial policy through his personal grief and psychological instability. Whether or not the poisoning allegations contained factual basis, Ivan's conviction that his wife had been murdered created paranoid framework that interpreted every subsequent political development as evidence of continuing conspiracy against his life and authority. His response was the creation of the OPRICHNINA, a parallel governmental structure that operated alongside traditional administrative institutions while possessing superior authority and resources for investigating and punishing suspected disloyalty throughout Russian society. The oprichniks who staffed this organization were selected for personal loyalty to Ivan rather than administrative competence or traditional aristocratic status, creating a new service class whose advancement depended entirely on imperial favor and whose survival required systematic oppression of established elites. The oprichniks were easily identifiable by their black clothing, which earned them the nickname Black Riders, and by the symbolic broom and dog's head that they carried to represent their mission of sweeping treachery from the realm while maintaining the loyalty and vigilance of hunting dogs protecting their masters' interests. This imagery was deliberately designed to create psychological intimidation while providing visual symbols that reminded everyone of the Oprichnik's authority to investigate, arrest, torture, and execute anyone suspected of disloyalty to imperial authority. The practical effect of the Oprichnina was to divide Russian territory into two zones: the Oprichnina lands that were under direct imperial control and administered by the new service class, and the Zemshchina territories that remained under traditional boyar administration but were subject to constant surveillance and potential intervention by Oprichnik forces. This division created systematic uncertainty about legal jurisdiction and political authority that made normal social and economic relationships impossible, while ensuring that no alternative power centers could develop sufficient strength to challenge imperial supremacy. The terror that the Oprichniks inflicted on Russian society was both systematic and apparently random, combining targeted elimination of specific individuals who posed genuine threats to Ivan's authority with broader campaigns of violence designed to create pervasive fear that would discourage any form of opposition or independent political organization. Entire families were destroyed based on accusations of treason that often lacked any factual basis, while their property was confiscated and redistributed to Oprichnik supporters who understood that their continued prosperity depended on maintaining the system that had elevated them. The most notorious example of Oprichnik brutality was the destruction of Novgorod in 1570, when Ivan became convinced that the city's leaders were planning to defect to Poland-Lithuania and establish independent political authority that would serve as a base for broader rebellion against his rule. The evidence for this alleged conspiracy was minimal and probably fabricated, but Ivan's psychological condition had deteriorated to the point where perceived threats were indistinguishable from actual dangers in his decision-making process. The assault on Novgorod was planned and executed as a deliberate atrocity designed to demonstrate the consequences of suspected disloyalty while providing opportunities for the systematic looting that had become a crucial element in maintaining Oprichnik loyalty and financing their operations. The city was surrounded, and its population was subjected to methodical torture and execution that continued for weeks, while Ivan personally supervised the proceedings from a specially constructed viewing platform that allowed him to observe the suffering while remaining safely distant from direct participation. The killing methods employed during the Novgorod massacre were deliberately designed to maximize terror rather than achieve efficient elimination of suspected conspirators, involving techniques that prolonged suffering while ensuring that survivors would carry traumatic memories that would discourage future resistance throughout the region. Victims were burned alive, flayed, impaled, and subjected to various forms of mutilation that served no practical purpose beyond satisfying Ivan's apparent psychological need to inflict elaborate suffering on people who had allegedly betrayed his trust. The economic destruction that accompanied this violence was equally systematic and devastating, involving the confiscation of merchant inventories, the destruction of manufacturing facilities, and the elimination of administrative records that had maintained Novgorod's commercial relationships with other Russian cities and foreign trading partners. The city's role as a major commercial center was permanently destroyed, creating economic disruption that affected trade relationships throughout northern Russia, while demonstrating that even economic prosperity could not protect communities from imperial wrath. The psychological impact of the Novgorod massacre extended far beyond its immediate victims to create an atmosphere of terror throughout Russian society that made normal political, social, and economic relationships impossible. If a city as wealthy and politically important as Novgorod could be destroyed based on unproven allegations of conspiracy, then no community, family, or individual could consider themselves safe from similar treatment based on accusations that might be equally groundless but politically convenient for settling personal scores or acquiring desired property. Ivan's personal participation in torture and execution became increasingly important to his psychological equilibrium as his mental condition deteriorated during the later years of his reign, suggesting that the infliction of suffering had evolved from political tool into personal necessity that satisfied psychological needs that conventional expressions of imperial authority could no longer address. Contemporary accounts describe the Tsar personally beating prisoners with iron-tipped staffs, supervising elaborate execution procedures, and apparently deriving satisfaction from observing human suffering that exceeded any rational calculation of political benefit. The murder of his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, in 1581, represented the climax of the Tsar's psychological deterioration and demonstrated how completely his capacity for rational decision-making had been compromised by decades of systematic violence and paranoid isolation from normal human relationships. The killing occurred during an argument about military policy, when the younger Ivan challenged his father's strategic decisions in ways that triggered explosive rage rather than prompting rational discussion about tactical alternatives. According to witness accounts, the elder Ivan struck his son in the head with the iron-tipped staff that he habitually carried, causing injuries that proved fatal within days, despite medical treatment and the Tsar's desperate attempts to save the heir, whose death would create succession, crisis, and potentially destroy the dynasty that he had spent his entire reign trying to secure against external and internal threats. The psychological trauma of this filicide haunted Ivan's final years and may have contributed to his own death in 1584. The aftermath of his son's death revealed the extent to which systematic terror had corrupted not only Ivan's psychological condition, but also the institutional structures that were supposed to ensure governmental continuity and stability. The OPRICHNINA had been officially disbanded in 1572, but its methods and personnel had been integrated into regular governmental operations in ways that made terror a permanent feature of Russian political culture, rather than a temporary expedient for dealing with specific threats. Ivan's final years were marked by desperate attempts to undo some of the damage that his policies had inflicted on Russian society, while maintaining the absolute authority that he viewed as essential for his personal survival and dynastic continuity. He made pilgrimages to monasteries where he sought spiritual absolution for his crimes, established charitable foundations designed to provide for victims' families, and attempted to negotiate foreign marriages that might strengthen Russia's international position while providing personal redemption through renewed domestic happiness. But these efforts at reconciliation and reform were undermined by his continued reliance on violence as the primary tool for maintaining political control, creating psychological contradictions that made consistent policy implementation impossible while perpetuating the cycle of fear and brutality that had defined his reign since the establishment of the OPRICHNINA. Ivan had created governmental institutions that could function only through systematic terror, making it impossible to abandon these methods without risking the collapse of his entire political system. His death in March 1584, reportedly while playing chess, ended a reign that had transformed Russia from a relatively conventional medieval autocracy into something approaching a modern totalitarian state, where systematic terror was used to restructure social relationships according to the psychological needs of a single individual whose paranoid fantasies had been given unlimited institutional expression. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible would influence Russian political culture for centuries, establishing precedents for state terror that would be revived and expanded by later rulers who understood that effective autocracy required the systematic destruction of independent social institutions and the creation of pervasive fear that made opposition psychologically impossible rather than merely politically dangerous.